Chapter 1578. The sky was clear, blue, and cloudless. It was like a huge, flawless sapphire, transparent and clear. When one stared at it, one's mind would be cleansed, bright, and pure. One would unknowingly be immersed in it, unable to extricate themselves. The lake water was green and sparkling, reflecting the sky. The water and the sky were connected. Chernzong stood by the lake. There were no enemies. There was nothing illogical. Was this the test of the fourth level of the king-naming pagoda? What was the test? Standing by the lake, Chernzong was silent and deep in thought. He was also waiting for the enemy to appear. However, time passed slowly, but no enemy appeared. Could it be that the test of this level was not about defeating the enemy, but something else? Chernzong's eyes lit up slightly. His thoughts immediately broke away from the original shackles and spread out. Perhaps the test of this level had nothing to do with the enemy. Or it could be said that the enemy on this level was not the same as the enemies on the previous 3 levels, but a hidden enemy. For example, an illusion. The beautiful scenery in front of him could be an illusion. It was so realistic that it was difficult to distinguish between reality and illusion. Everything was vivid and lifelike, just like the real sky and lake. As soon as he had doubts, Chernzong observed more carefully. His divine consciousness also spread out. Under the tyrannical divine consciousness, Chernzong felt that it was unreal. Sure enough, this was an illusion. It turned out that the test of the 4th level was not direct combat strength, but to see through illusions. In other words, it was a test of divine consciousness. A powerful cultivator not only had to have sufficient strength, but also had to have strong and pure divine consciousness. Neither could be lacking. A true powerhouse had no obvious shortcomings. Chernzong's divine consciousness was much stronger and purer than those of the same level. It was not inferior even to those of a half-step great sage. Therefore, as soon as he had doubts, he quickly found the problem and eliminated it in an instant. The beautiful scenery of the mountains and rivers swayed in an instant, like ripples on the surface of water, and disappeared like an illusion. It was still a dark space. A ray of light fell on Chernzong. Immediately, Chernzong ascended to the 5th floor. On the 5th level of the king-naming pagoda, the darkness retreated. Chernzong found himself in a circular room. Besides the ground beneath his feet, the walls around him were filled with finger-sized holes. The densely packed holes were deep and bottomless, emitting a chilling aura that made one's heart palpitate. Especially the way they were arranged so densely that it would make one's scalp go numb. Soon after, there seemed to be an extremely soft sound. It seemed as if there was only one sound, yet it also seemed as if there were tens of thousands of daos gathered together. Chernzong's pupils contracted slightly, and a cold light flashed across his eyes. Sharp points seemed to have emerged from the countless holes in the surroundings. They were incomparably sharp and shone with cold light. Without any warning, numerous spikes that were thinner than a finger instantly shot out from the holes at an extremely fast and shocking speed. Quick, ruthless. In the blink of an eye, densely packed spikes shot towards Chernzong from all directions with a sharpness that could pierce through everything. Too fast. Extremely fast. This speed had already reached the limit of the 7th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage. The test of the king-naming pagoda was closely related to a person's cultivation. The lowest level was the same as the person's cultivation, and it would continue to rise. If one passed the 5th level, it would cause the 5-colored heavenly flower to explode. It was also very shocking. Therefore, the test was not easy. The speed of the spikes was equivalent to the limit of the 7th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage. Without sufficient strength, it was impossible to dodge. Moreover, there were dozens of spikes that shot out in an instant. It was not something that could be dodged. One would also have to defend against it. Chernzong's reaction was extremely fast. The moment he unsheathed his extreme-edge sword, an extremely dazzling sword light streaked out in all directions. It was an arc of light, as if the water and the sky were intersecting. It had a kind of elegance and brilliance. Chen Zong did not dodge. Instead, he slashed out with his sword and blocked all the spikes that shot towards him from all directions. Every spike was shockingly fast. However, its strength was not as fast as its speed. It was equivalent to the strength of an ordinary late-stage, 7th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage. Of course, this was only a relative term. If one's cultivation was at the early stage of the 7th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage, their combined strength would only reach the limit of the 7th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage. The chances of them passing the 5th level were not high. At the very least, one would need to have the strength of an 8th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage to have a chance. However, it was not 100% certain. Chen Zong's strength was naturally not something an ordinary 8th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage could compare to. His sword technique was extremely profound. With a single slash, he blocked all the spikes without suffering any damage. The second wave, the spikes shot out again. There were hundreds of them, and they were even more threatening. Chen Zong's expression did not change as he slashed out with his sword. The sword light split and enveloped the surroundings, blocking all the spikes. The hundreds of spikes were all blocked by Chen Zong's sword. Similarly, they were unable to hurt Chen Zong. However, this was not the end. There was a third wave. In an instant, black spikes shot out from all the black holes. They were extremely sharp. Thousands of spikes. This time, there were thousands of spikes. They were densely packed and terrifying. Chen Zong's expression turned slightly solemn. The pressure from thousands of spikes was much greater than hundreds of spikes. A sword light shot out. It was only a single slash, but it had the terrifying aura of 10,000 swords. Infinite slash. Infinite slash. With this one slash, all the spikes were blocked. They were unable to hit Chen Zong at all. He was fully focused on guarding against the fourth wave. Based on the pattern of the previous 3 waves, the fourth wave might have tens of thousands of spikes. If there were tens of thousands of spikes, the threat to him would increase greatly. When that time came, he would have to bring out more strength to deal with it. However, after the third wave, there was no fourth wave. The third wave was the test of the 5th level. Chen Zong had passed the test and ascended to the 6th level. Only the most elite king stage geniuses had a chance of passing the 6th level. An emperor stage genius would have a higher chance of passing. The 6th level was not a dark space. Instead, it was a pavilion. The pavilion was simple and unadorned. It stood on a small hill that was 100 meters tall. In the pavilion, there was a peerless beauty, like a fairy, sitting elegantly and quietly. On the table in front of her was a silver wine pot and 2 silver cups. "You're here. I've been waiting for you for a long time." The peerless beauty raised her head. Her bright and limpid eyes seemed to be able to see through time and space. They landed on Chen Zong's face. In that instant, Chen Zong's soul trembled uncontrollably. There was an indescribable feeling. Tenderness. Sweetness. When the peerless beauty spoke, an invisible wave seemed to spread out. It made Chen Zong feel as if she had really been waiting for his arrival in the pavilion for a long time. It was as if he had made an appointment with this beauty and met her here. This feeling was very strange. It seemed to be there, but it was also not. In that instant, Chen Zong had a vague feeling that he could not determine. It was as if he had really made an appointment with this old man at some point in time. This feeling prompted Chen Zong to take a step forward. He walked up the steps of the small hill, step by step, as if he was a mortal. With every step he took, the feeling of having made an appointment became more and more obvious. "Come, have a taste of the fine wine that I spent 1,000 years to brew." The peerless beauty stood up slightly, but her face was full of smiles. It was as if 100 flowers had bloomed in an instant. She reached out and gestured for Chen Zong to come over and sit down in front of her. The 1,000-year-old wine immediately made Chen Zong's eyes light up. A trace of longing emerged in his heart. It was a longing to drink the 1,000-year-old wine. His footsteps quickened as he climbed quickly. There were a total of 100 steps from the bottom to the top. The smile on the peerless beauty's face was enough to make people feel enraptured. Gradually, Chernzong climbed to the top of the mountain. He walked down the last step and stepped into the pavilion. Without hesitation, he sat down on the stone bench opposite the peerless beauty. An indescribable fragrance floated from her delicate body. The stone bench was firm and cold, causing Chernzong to instantly feel refreshed. It was as if all distracting thoughts had been eliminated, and his essence, energy, and spirit had been raised to an astonishing level. He wasn't affected by anything, but it also caused the fragrance to become even more enchanting. Come. The peerless beauty stood up slightly. Her slender and white jade-like hand lifted the wine pot and poured the wine into Chernzong's cup. The translucent amber wine flowed down from the long spout of the pot. It had an indescribable beauty like moving clouds and flowing water. A faint smell like the clouds in the sky floated over. It made Chernzong feel as if he wanted to fly up into the sky. He flew with the wind, roaming the world and comprehending the mysteries. In an instant, a strong and intoxicating wine fragrance seemed to fill the air. It was as if he had fallen from a high altitude into the boundless sea. He wandered at the bottom of the sea and swam with the giant sharks. This wine fragrance was sometimes light, sometimes strong, and sometimes distant. It seemed to come from a very distant place with the wind. It also seemed to be right under the nose. It was changeable. It was like a dream. This was the magic and attraction of the 1,000-year-old wine. The sound of the wine falling into the exquisite and simple silver cup was also incomparably clear and pure. When it fell into the ears, it was like the most beautiful music in the world. It blended with the ever-changing and dreamy wine fragrance, and became the most attractive and tempting thing in the world. It replaced everything else. The peerless beauty's eyes moved. She raised her head slightly and put down the wine pot. "Please have a taste." The peerless beauty's voice was as soft as the breeze. It was also as pleasant as the tinkling of spring water. It refreshed the heart and directly penetrated the heart. Chernzong could no longer resist. He picked up the exquisite and simple cup behind him and quickly brought it to the tip of his nose. He sniffed slightly. Suddenly, the ever-changing and dreamy wine fragrance rushed into his nose, went straight into his lungs, and then spread all over his body. He felt as if he was floating in the clouds and had lost all weight. He was incomparably relaxed. It was also as if he was soaking in a hot spring. The warm spring water removed all impurities and left him exhausted. Chernzong's face was full of intoxication. He could not help but close his eyes. He completely ignored everything in the outside world and seemed to be completely unable to perceive anything outside his body. Chapter 1579. Tickets. The Dominator needs tickets for the year-end inventory. Brothers, please help us. A small hill. A pavilion. The peerless beauty and Chernzong. This was an eternal and beautiful painting that seemed to have transformed into a brand. Chernzong opened his eyes. The intoxicated look in his eyes slowly dissipated and became clear. The intoxicated look on his face also disappeared quickly and became cold as the iron in the deep sea. The strange smile on the peerless beauty's face suddenly froze. "You are a beauty and the wine is good wine. Unfortunately, my ambition is not in this." Chernzong opened his mouth and said slowly. His voice was low and sonorous, like the sound of a long sword. It became more and more resounding and earth-shattering. "My ambition is in the sword." The word sword left his mouth and resounded through the world. It was as vast and mighty as thunder, and an extreme sharpness tore through the heavens. The stone table and wine jug in front of him were instantly split apart, and the peerless beauty was not spared either. She was instantly ripped apart. This sword light, containing extreme sharpness and sword intent, broke through heaven and earth. The light suddenly fell, and Chunzong's body flew up again. The 6th floor passed. He stepped into the 7th floor. Since ancient times, those who could enter the 7th floor were all emperor-level geniuses. Chunzong was confident that he could reach or even pass the 7th floor. However, after seeing it, he was still a little surprised. The 1st to 3rd floors tested one's strength directly, the 4th floor tested one's divine thoughts, the 5th floor tested one's reaction and strength, and the 6th floor tested one's mind and willpower. If one was addicted to it, they would fail the tower. Chunzong was addicted at first, but he soon sobered up. However, he did not immediately get rid of it. Instead, he chose to taste the wine. After all, this was Chunzong's hobby. Since he had tasted the 1,000-year-old wine, Chunzong sobered up and did not immerse himself in it. Sword Dao was his true pursuit. As for other things, they were just decorations. He could have them, but he could not be addicted. On the 7th floor, the light suddenly lit up and a canyon appeared in front of him. The canyon stretched to the sky as if there was no end. Chunzong stood in front of the canyon. Rhythmic footsteps were heard as a figure stepped out from the shadows of the canyon. A gust of wind blew past, swirling up the dust and sand in the air. A desolate, killing intent gradually spread out between the heavens and the earth. His long robe fluttered in the wind and sand, and his long hair also fluttered. Under his long and narrow eyes, traces of cold light flickered like ice, releasing a shocking coldness and killing intent. He was dressed in a coarse robe that resembled yellow sand, with a long sword in a crude scabbard at his waist. Every step he took seemed to have been calculated with the utmost precision. He was like an ascetic cultivator in a harsh environment. As soon as this person appeared, Chunzong's pupils constricted. A trace of horror grew in his heart and quickly spread out. Very strong. For a moment it was difficult for him to determine the cultivation of the other party. He only felt that the other party was a threat. However, this was already the 7th level of the king-naming pagoda. If one could pass the 7th level, they would be able to trigger the 7-colored heavenly flower. That would be an earth-shattering phenomenon. It was rare to see one in 100 years. Naturally, the difficulty of the test would be high. He was a swordsman who had walked out of the Gobi Grand Canyon. He was a strong opponent. Immediately, the battle intent condensed and shot up from Chunzong's body into the sky. The yellow sand swordsman also seemed to be attracted. He also released a terrifying wave of sword intent. The sword intent shot up into the sky as if it was going to tear the heavens apart. As soon as the sword intent appeared, the originally gentle wind and sand instantly became violent, resonating with the sword intent. In an instant, Chunzong and the yellow sand swordsman both moved. Chunzong took a step forward. His feet were wrapped in dense lightning. It was the 6th step of the Thunder Stomp 9 Heavens. Its speed was astonishing. The yellow sand swordsman also moved. Countless sandstorms swept up as if supporting his legs. It looked like he was flying in the wind and sand. Close. Unsheathe the sword. In an instant, the two of them passed by each other. As they were unsheathed, they had already exchanged more than 100 blows. Great! Chunzong suddenly felt excited. The blood in his body boiled. He turned around and his sword pierced through the air. It was as fast and fierce as a shooting star. The yellow sand swordsman also turned around in an instant. His long sword swept through the air, stirring up a sandstorm. Its power was shocking to the extreme. It was indeed powerful. In just a few breaths' time, it had exchanged more than 1,000 blows with Chunzong. It was evenly matched. The cultivation of the early 7th heaven saint realm erupted in an instant. The terrifying power shook the heavens and earth. It was as if it could shatter everything. Lightning surged from the soles of his feet to his entire body, covering his shoulders. It made Chunzong look like a lightning swordsman. The 7th step of the Thunder Stomp 9 Heavens. Chunzong's speed increased. His sword pierced through the air towards the yellow sand swordsman. However, the yellow sand swordsman pointed his long sword and spat out a word, "Suppress." In an instant, an invisible force and will descended from the sky and directly struck Chen Zong's body, causing his body to tremble. The lightning on his body was extinguished, and his saint energy, tyrannical chaotic heavenly energy, and astonishing chi and blood were suppressed into the depths of his body, making it difficult for him to move. The world seemed to be filled with an invisible, colorless, and boundless force field, causing Chen Zong to lose all of his extraordinary powers, leaving him with only an ordinary level of physical strength. Immediately, Chen Zong also realized that the yellow sand swordsman was the same. There was no strong physical strength. There was no extraordinary strength. Could it be that they were going to compete with their swordsmanship? That seemed to be the case. The yellow sand swordsman rushed again. His feet stepped on the dry sand and stone ground. He swept toward Chen Zong at an amazing speed. If this speed was compared to before, it was like the difference between heaven and earth. However, if it was an ordinary person, it was as fast as lightning. At this moment, both the yellow sand swordsman and Chen Zong had their extraordinary strength suppressed. They were only left with ordinary strength. Therefore, their speed did not seem slow. Chen Zong also moved. Although he only had ordinary strength, his ultimate control of his own strength was not weakened or suppressed. This control was not strength, but an ability. It was an invisible ability that could not be suppressed. His muscles trembled. The power was transmitted to his feet and then burst out. His whole body shot out like an arrow. He was even faster than the yellow sand swordsman. He drew his sword. A sword without the support of extraordinary strength, such as saint energy, chi and blood chi, chaotic heaven energy, and Taoist will could not be called a swordsmanship. It could only be called a swordsmanship. It was a pure technique of wielding the sword. It was the most basic of all, and it tested one's basic skills. Chen Zong paid a lot of attention to the basics of swordsmanship. However, he had never thought that he would one day have to challenge the King Naming Tower and fight with a strong opponent. However, he had encountered a similar situation when he entered the Xianming microcosm. The two sides approached each other. Their swords broke through the air and clashed. Stab, slash, bang, strike. The most basic sword techniques were performed to their heart's content under their swords. The sword light was bright and intense. Even though they did not have the support of extraordinary powers and only relied on the strength of ordinary people, they were still able to cut through the air with exquisite sword techniques, forming sword chis that streaked across the surroundings and the ground, leaving intersecting sword scars. Moreover, this kind of exquisite swordsmanship, without the support of extraordinary strength, was performed with only ordinary strength. Every strike was a direct close combat. Every strike was extremely dangerous. Once touched, one would be injured immediately. With the body of an ordinary person, if one was injured, it would have a significant impact on one's strength. Chen Zong was very excited by this kind of life-and-death battle where only sword skills were used without the use of extraordinary strength. He felt a kind of horror and trembling from the bottom of his heart. It was not fear, but a kind of madness that came from the depths of his bones. They were evenly matched. To his heart's content, Chen Zong forgot everything and displayed his swordsmanship to his heart's content. Even without the support of extraordinary strength, with only pure swordsmanship, there was a kind of true charm to it. It was as if he was about to touch something. The yellow sand swordsman's swordsmanship was also very advanced. Every strike was astonishing and contained a trace of indescribable charm. It was as if with every strike, there would be yellow sand coming at him. This was not extraordinary strength. It was a mystery derived from the yellow sand swordsman's cultivation of swordsmanship to an astonishing level. This mystery made Chen Zong feel strange. As they fought, he also felt as if he was in the middle of yellow sand. Chen Zong could not help but think of a method in the past. A method of integrating spiritual will into swordsmanship to interfere with the world. It was a method that he had comprehended in the Xianming small world. However, as his swordsmanship improved, it had already been sublimated. But now, it seemed that this method still had great potential to be unearthed. At least, this was the case in the Yellow Sand swordsman's swordsmanship. However, Chen Zong would not take this path again, because it had already been sublimated. Fight. The fight was fierce. The fight was crazy. The two swords clashed, constantly bursting out astonishing sparks. They sputtered in all directions as if they were going to ignite everything. With a slight shake of his wrist, the sword body trembled. One sword split into 3 and 3 into 9. 9 beams of sword light were incomparably sharp. They shot out from the front and shrouded the Yellow Sand swordsman. The Yellow Sand swordsman turned his sword. It seemed as if yellow sand was sprinkling down to block the sword light. Their bodies crisscrossed, and they swung their swords again. This time, the 9 beams of sword light turned into arcs and shot out from all directions. It was impossible to guard against and resist. The Yellow Sand swordsman tried his best, but he could only block 8 beams of sword light. He was hit by one of the beams of sword light. His arm was immediately pierced, and he was immediately injured. Kill him while he was injured. The 9 beams of sword light shot out again. This time, it was not a straight line or an arc. Instead, it condensed into one and became more and more dazzling. Kill. Chen Zong used all the strength in his body. It was an outburst that surpassed the limit. The sword was unstoppable. It was as fierce and overbearing as a meteor from outer space. The sword, with the overbearing power of heaven and earth, directly shattered the Yellow Sand. The Yellow Sand swordsman's sword pierced straight through. Kill. The Yellow Sand swordsman's arm holding the sword fell limply. Immediately, his body dissipated in front of Chen Zong, like a wisp of sand scattered between heaven and earth. In the next breath, Chen Zong felt that all the suppressed power had returned to his body. It was a feeling that he had not felt for a long time. The feeling of mastering power was really, really good. Chapter 1580. Inside the King Naming Tower, it seemed like a long time had passed, but to the people outside, it was only a little more than 2 hours. An hour or so was nothing to these people. Even if it was 20 hours, they could still wait. One had to know that after reaching the Saint Realm, it was normal for one to cultivate for several days at a time. Even a dozen days or even a few months was not out of the ordinary. With Chen Zong's talent, it won't be difficult for him to detonate the 8-colored heavenly flower. Skyfrost Holy Sun and Ancient Holy Sun thought to themselves. As for the 9-colored heavenly flower, they didn't dare to continue thinking, because if they did, they would think that Chen Zong was more likely to detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower than them. However, it was hard to say whether he could really detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower. If he really did, it would shock both ancient and modern times. In the same era, it was extremely rare for 2 people to detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower. From ancient times until now, it had only happened once. That was the era of the great Emperor Lingwu. There was also an extremely talented person who was only slightly inferior to the great Emperor Lingwu. Just like the great Emperor Lingwu, he had detonated the 9-colored heavenly flower. That person was now ranked 3rd on the 9-colored king naming monument. First, the Taishan Holy Sun detonated the 9-colored heavenly flower, then the Skyfrost Holy Sun and Ancient Holy Sun detonated the 8-colored heavenly flower. This was already shocking. If Chen Zong could detonate the 8-colored heavenly flower, it would be even more shocking. If he could detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower, it would become a legend. On the 8th floor of the King Naming Tower, it was a jade wall in a valley. Standing in front of the valley's jade wall was engraved with veined patterns. The densely packed veined patterns spread out from the center and eventually covered the entire front of the jade wall. At first glance, the veined patterns were incomparably complex and mysterious. Then what was the test of this floor? Immediately, a thought silently entered Chen Zong's mind, and Chen Zong knew. It turned out that the test of this floor wasn't cultivation, strength, divine sense, reaction, or sword skills, but comprehension. The purpose of challenging the king-conferring pagoda was to obtain a title and obtain the acknowledgement of the king-conferring pagoda and the will of heaven and earth. This would allow one to better comprehend the mysteries of heaven and earth, as well as Tao insight. Unlike other challenges, the kingship pagoda's challenges did not focus on one's cultivation. After all, most people who had broken through to the saint realm within 10 years would not have a high cultivation. Thus, the king-naming pagoda's test was more comprehensive. It tested one's strength, the purity and application of spiritual will, the tenacity of one's will, one's reaction speed, martial arts foundation, and control of power. Now, it tested one's comprehension ability. It could be said that this was a comprehensive test. This sort of test was the most difficult and also the most accurate. The 8th level tested one's comprehension ability, which was to comprehend the patterns on the valley's jade wall. As for what mysteries the patterns contained, it was hard to say. According to the information that entered his mind, the patterns on the jade wall were divided into 9 rings. From the inside to the outside, they were the first ring, the second ring, and the third ring. Only by comprehending the 4th ring would one be considered to have passed the 8th level. If one wanted to enter the 9th level, they would have to comprehend the 7th ring. Furthermore, there was a time limit to the comprehension. A water hourglass suddenly appeared in the air, and water began to drip down. Chen Zong immediately abandoned all distracting thoughts and wholeheartedly began to comprehend. The first ring was the centermost ring. The outline of the patterns contained an indescribable mystery. Those who did not have enough comprehension ability would not be able to comprehend anything at all and would instead feel dizzy. In other words, one's comprehension ability had to reach the level of an emperor-grade genius to be able to comprehend it. However, if one wanted to comprehend the 4th ring, the difficulty was not low. At the very least, one had to have the comprehension ability of a top emperor-grade genius. Chen Zong's comprehension ability was extremely high and his foundation was deep, so he quickly comprehended the mysteries of the first ring. He immediately extended it to the second ring and continued to comprehend it. The patterns on the valley's jade wall were profound, but Chen Zong did not know what they were used for. It did not seem to have any use. If he had to say that it was useful, it should be used to challenge the king-naming pagoda. Moreover, this kind of comprehension was very strange. He could not describe what it was, but it was directed to the core of comprehension. Everything else was useless. Only the most basic and true comprehension ability could comprehend the mysteries within and direct it to the heart. In this way, the test of comprehension ability was even more realistic. Soon, Chen Zong comprehended the mysteries of the second ring. A mysterious feeling gradually became clear. He began to comprehend the third ring. The patterns of the third ring were denser and larger in scope. The mysteries contained were deeper and more difficult to comprehend. However, the mysteries of the third ring were nothing to Chen Zong. He only spent a little more time to comprehend it. The 4th ring. When Chen Zong began to comprehend the 4th ring, it meant that Chen Zong was already qualified to detonate the 8-colored heavenly flower. However, this was not the end that Chen Zong wanted. Although he was not sure if he could detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower, he had this thought and goal. Moreover, he had to work hard and do his best. The mysteries of the 4th ring were much more profound than the 3rd ring. If one did not have a top-notch emperor-level comprehension ability, it would be impossible to comprehend any mysteries from it. However, comprehension ability was one of Chen Zong's strongest aspects. With the first 3 rings as a foundation, Chen Zong quickly comprehended the mysteries of the 4th ring. The more he comprehended, the more Chen Zong felt that the mysteries contained in the 9 layers of veined patterns on the jade wall of the valley were the mysteries of heaven and earth. They didn't belong to any aspect, nor did they lean towards any aspect, but they covered all of them. It was like a general outline and overview of martial arts technique. It was also like the foundation of everything, like the roots of a tree. Vaguely, his heart was telling him that the patterns on the valley's jade wall seemed useless, but to him it was actually very useful. It was just that he could not see anything at the moment. In fact, the 9 layers of patterns on the valley's jade wall were very beneficial to any cultivator. The prerequisite was that one could comprehend the mysteries within. The more layers one comprehended, the more beneficial it would be. If possible, Chen Zong planned to comprehend all the patterns on the valley's jade wall and master all 9 layers of their mysteries. The Taishan saint had been able to enter the 9th layer because he had comprehended at least 7 layers of the valley's jade wall. His comprehension ability was definitely not inferior to the Taishan saint's. This was confidence. After comprehending the mysteries of the 4th ring, he began to comprehend the 5th ring. Shortly after, Chen Zong also comprehended the mysteries of the 5th ring. He began to comprehend the 6th ring. If others knew about Chen Zong's comprehension speed, they would probably be very shocked. Chen Zong comprehended the mysteries of the 6th ring once again. He immediately began to comprehend the 7th ring. The mysteries of the 7th ring were immediately much more difficult than those of the 6th ring. Even with Chen Zong's comprehension ability, he still felt that it was very difficult to comprehend. At this moment, almost half of the water in the hourglass had dripped down. In other words, Chen Zong still had half of the time to comprehend the last 3 rings. However, he did not know how many rings he could comprehend. Now that Chen Zong had comprehended the first 6 rings, he could already enter the 9th layer and accept the 9th layer's test. He would work hard to detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower. Chen Zong used his superb comprehension ability and the foundation of the first 6 rings to comprehend the 7th ring. The mysteries of the 7th ring were slowly analyzed and comprehended bit by bit. Suddenly, a feeling of enlightenment filled his soul. This made Chen Zong know that he had successfully comprehended the mysteries of the 7th ring. Without hesitation, he began to comprehend the 8th ring. The more he comprehended, the more Chen Zong felt that the mysteries of the 9th layer of the jade wall in the valley would be of great benefit to his future cultivation. As for what the benefits were, Chen Zong did not know. However, as long as there were benefits, it was worth his effort. The difficulty of the 8th ring increased a lot. However, with his comprehension ability, he could still comprehend the mysteries contained in it. The mysteries of the 8th ring were slowly revealed by Chen Zong's powerful comprehension ability. However, every time he made progress, he felt that it was very difficult. In the end, Chen Zong succeeded in comprehending the mysteries of the 8th ring. Regardless of the hourglass, Chen Zong immediately began to comprehend the 9th ring. As soon as he began to comprehend, Chen Zong's expression changed slightly. The difficulty of comprehending the 9th ring was much higher than that of the 8th ring. At the beginning of the 8th ring, Chen Zong could still comprehend some superficial knowledge. However, he did not know where to start with the 9th ring. However, Chen Zong knew that comprehending the 9th ring would be more beneficial to him. He took a deep breath and calmed his slightly fluctuating emotions. Only by remaining calm and concentrating could he comprehend the mysteries. If his emotions fluctuated, it would affect his comprehension ability. Calm, like the deep sea, like ice, no distracting thoughts could affect or disturb him. Unconsciously, Chen Zong forgot everything. In his eyes, in his mind, and in his heart, there was only the 9th ring. It was as if a layer of fog had been lifted. There was a feeling of enlightenment. The mysteries of the 9th ring began to appear. It was difficult to get started, but once he got started, Chernzong could take the opportunity to comprehend the mysteries of the ninth ring. Slowly, he began to analyze and comprehend the mysteries of the ninth ring. The water in the hourglass continued to drip. It seemed slow, but the water above the hourglass was decreasing. There was not much left. Chernzong did not notice. At this moment, Chernzong was completely immersed in comprehending the mysteries of the ninth ring. He had completely forgotten about the outside world. The mysteries of the ninth ring. 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. As the water continued to drip, Chernzong comprehended 90%. When it reached 90%, the difficulty of comprehending seemed to have increased significantly. 91%, 92%, 93%. However, there was only a thin layer of water left in the hourglass. It would soon be empty. 94%. Chernzong did not know that the water in the hourglass was almost empty. He was still comprehending wholeheartedly. 95%, 96%, 97%, 98%, 99%. Immediately, the last drop of water in the hourglass dripped from the hole. It seemed to be slow, but it also seemed to be fast. It continued to fall. Once it fell into the water below, it meant the end of the time. Drip. The sound was extremely soft, but also extremely loud. It was as if it suddenly rang in Chernzong's mind. Chapter 1581. At the last moment, Chernzong successfully comprehended the 9 layers of profound inscriptions on the jade wall of the spiritual valley. It was like an imprint. The mysteries naturally entered Chernzong's mind and he grasped them. Now, he still did not know what use they had. But his instincts told him that they were useful. They would be very useful in the future. That was enough. Cultivation was something that he had to compete for now and in the future. It was very important. After comprehending the mysteries of the 9 layers of profound inscriptions on the jade wall, Chernzong naturally stepped into the 9th layer. The 9th layer was a dark space, just like the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd layers. Then, a ray of light flashed past. It was as if the world had been created. The world changed, and a world appeared before Chernzong's eyes. Chernzong was like an outsider. He observed the changes in the world from a high point of view. It changed from a barren world to a flourishing world, and then to a barren world again. Decline after the peak. In the end, everything quieted down. The changes in the world also stopped. Chernzong only felt a blur before his eyes. It was as if time and space had changed. A palace. In front of him was a palace. The palace was not luxurious, but it had an indescribable simplicity, majesty, and majesty. It stood in the world as if it could suppress the world and time and space. The palace door was closed. It was black after the 9 colors merged. It was so dark that it seemed to be able to absorb all light. It also seemed to contain endless mysteries. Above the closed door, there was a similar black signboard. On the signboard, there were 4 large words that were flowing with brilliant light. Lingwu Imperial Palace. Chernzong read in a low voice. Outside the king-naming tower, the Taishan saint's eyes shone as he stared at the 9-colored king-naming tablet. From top to bottom, there were 14 titles and 14 names. The first title was the Lingwu Emperor. The order of the titles represented the difference between high and low. In other words, since ancient times, no one had surpassed the Lingwu Emperor. The second title was the Sword Emperor. He was a peerless genius from an era before the Lingwu Emperor. Before the appearance of the Lingwu Emperor, he had always been the top genius in the Lingwu Holy World. But after the appearance of the Lingwu Emperor, his light was overshadowed by the Lingwu Emperor. Even so, it was undeniable that the Sword Emperor was still a dazzling existence. His name was known throughout history. The third title was the Eternal Night Demon King. He was a peerless genius from the same era as the Lingwu Emperor. A few years after the Lingwu Emperor, he had entered the king-naming tower. He had exploded the 9-colored heavenly flower. He was ranked third on the 9-colored king naming tablet. This title. Lingwu. Lingwu Wu Emperor. The fourth title was a new title. Xian Ancient Saint King. This was the title that the god of the Taishan Holy Temple had obtained after entering the king naming tower. The Taishan Holy Sun was not satisfied with being ranked fourth. His goal was to surpass the Lingwu Emperor and be ranked first. Unfortunately, he was no match for the Eternal Night Demon King. Lingwu Imperial Palace. It sounded like it had something to do with the Lingwu Emperor or Emperor Lingwu. Chen Zong suddenly exerted force with both hands and pushed open the heavy doors of the Imperial Palace. Someone else is here. How many moves can you take from me? A vigorous and heavy voice suddenly sounded. In an instant, a majestic and steady aura rushed over, as if an invisible mountain was moving horizontally. Chen Zong's eyes narrowed slightly as he stared ahead. At the end of the hall, there was a tall and sturdy figure sitting on a throne. The figure was as heavy as a mountain, and there was a faint trace of domineering aura about him. You are? Chen Zong asked. I'm Saint King Chongshan. The burly figure on the throne immediately stood up, and the surrounding air seemed to be unable to withstand his power, as it turned into countless ripples that spread outwards. Vaguely, a strong wind seemed to howl, engulfing the entire palace. Its might was astonishing. Saint King Chongshan. Chen Zong narrowed his eyes. There were originally 13 titles on the 9-colored king naming tablet. After the Taishan Holy Sun, there were 14 titles. The title at the bottom was Saint King Chongshan. It was written on the outside that it was Lingwu Imperial Palace. Why did he not meet the Lingwu Emperor but Saint King Chongshan? Chen Zong did not understand. After all, the words Lingwu Imperial Palace made it easy to associate it with the Lingwu Emperor. Your cultivation is in the early 7th level Saint Realm. My cultivation will be the same as yours. If you defeat me, you will not only ignite the 9-colored heavenly flower, but you will also be able to challenge the second palace. Saint King Chongshan's burly body stood up, emitting an extremely shocking power. The terrifying pressure was as heavy as a mountain, and it felt as if an invisible mountain was pushing down. How many palaces are there in Lingwu Imperial Palace? Chen Zong released his powerful aura as he spoke. This was a chance to learn more about Lingwu Imperial Palace, or the 9th level of the king naming tower. There are as many palaces in Lingwu Imperial Palace as there are titles on the 9-colored king naming tablet, Saint King Chongshan said. Then, a smile appeared on his rugged face. If you can defeat the Lingwu Emperor, this palace will be named after your title. Chen Zong immediately understood. Since the Lingwu Emperor was ranked first on the 9-colored king naming tablet, this palace was named the Lingwu Imperial Palace. There were 14 titles on the 9-colored king naming tablet, so there were 14 palaces in Lingwu Imperial Palace. For example, the palace at the very front was called the Great Mountain Palace. If he defeated Saint King Chongshan, not only would he be listed on the 9-colored king naming tablet, but he would also be able to challenge the second palace. What if he couldn't defeat Saint King Chongshan? Saint King Chongshan seemed to sense Chen Zong's curiosity, so he spoke again. If you can't defeat me, you'll have to withstand at least 100 of my attacks to be qualified to detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower and be listed on the 9-colored king naming tablet. Dong. Saint King Chongshan stood up and took a step forward like a mountain giant. The entire palace shook and the air seemed to explode. It surged endlessly, and his power grew more and more shocking. He was only at the early 7th level of the Saint Rudiment realm, but Chen Zong felt that he was terrifying and shocking. Chen Zong narrowed his eyes, and a sharp glint flashed in his eyes. His blood surged and his saint power spun. Traces of battle intent soared into the sky. Saint King Chongshan. This was a peerless genius who could detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower in the ancient times. Chernzong, on the other hand, was extremely lucky to be able to fight with such a peerless genius after countless eras. Then, let me see the demeanor of an ancient peerless genius, Chernzong said to himself and took a step forward. This step caused the wind and clouds to change. This step caused a sharp blade to cut through the air. This step caused an unparalleled sharpness. Saint King Chongshan's expression changed slightly. His eyes shone with a strong light, and he was faintly excited. Fight! After he took a step down the stairs, his entire body charged forward like a moving mountain. Suddenly, he raised his incomparably violent fist and instantly blasted it out. In an instant, an incomparably powerful aura condensed in the fist. It was like a mountain's fist was blasted out, and the air seemed to be compressed by the impact. It was ferocious and unparalleled. Chernzong's palm was like the edge of a sword. He slashed out in the air, and a sword light tore through the air. It immediately split the powerful fist force and slashed toward Saint King Chongshan like a hot knife through butter. Saint King Chongshan was an ancient peerless genius. Among his peers, he could be said to be invincible. Now, Chernzong was also an ancient peerless genius. Among his peers, he was almost invincible. This was a confrontation between peerless geniuses who were separated by many eras. Whether it was Chernzong or Saint King Chongshan, they could not help but feel excited. Their fighting spirit soared into the sky. That move was just a probing move. After all, Chernzong was completely unfamiliar with Saint King Chongshan, and Saint King Chongshan was also very unfamiliar with Chernzong. When facing an unfamiliar opponent, one had to test him to know his strength and how to deal with him better. In the blink of an eye, the two sides exchanged dozens of moves. The power of their attacks became stronger and stronger, and they gradually grasped all of the other party's moves and skills. Mountain Hing Fist. The low shout was dull and vigorous. As soon as the three words fell, Saint King Chongshan's aura skyrocketed in an instant. He punched out. It seemed similar to before, but in fact, its power was even more tyrannical and terrifying. When this punch was out, the shadow of a mountain condensed in it and pushed forward. A shocking rumbling sound resounded in all directions, causing Chernzong's expression to change drastically. This punch was vigorous and fierce. The extreme-edge sword was unsheathed. The sword light was blazing to the extreme, and it was extremely sharp. In an instant it tore through the sky and attacked. Extreme edge slash. After the fierce battle, Chernzong knew that Saint King Chongshan's fighting style was vigorous, steady, and heavy. The aura was like a mountain. He did not pay attention to any subtle changes. He directly pushed forward and charged forward with an astonishing aura. One punch could suppress an era. This was Saint King Chongshan's fist. The fist that made the geniuses of the same era as him feel despair. The fist that made the cultivators of the same generation of the same era shrouded in shadows. Now Chernzong was facing such a fist. However, Chernzong was not afraid. There was only fighting spirit. Fight. Although Saint King Chongshan's fist was very, very strong, Chernzong's sword was not weak at all. In just 10 breaths, Chernzong and Saint King Chongshan were fighting fiercely. Terrifying energy overflowed, as if it was going to tear down the Chongshan Palace. However, the Chongshan Palace was extremely sturdy. Not to mention the bombardment of the two's power, even if it was 10 times stronger, it would not be damaged at all. Lifeless sword style. When the sword was slashed out, an astonishing killing intent condensed in it. It was as if it could kill all life, causing Saint King Chongshan to be slightly surprised. Chongshan. With a low shout, Saint King Chongshan's eyes suddenly emitted an extremely shocking light. It was as if the shadow of a mountain condensed in his eyes. The energy in his body burst forth, and all the energy in his body poured into his right fist. It was like a strong bow that was pulled to the extreme. Unparalleled. Unparalleled domineering. Boom. A punch blasted out, and a black mountain charged forward. The Black Mountain seemed to be incomparably condensed and vigorous to the extreme. The Black Mountain exuded a shocking pressure, as though it was filled with a terrifying weight. Under the heavy pressure, everything in the surroundings was suppressed and flowed backwards, causing the Black Mountain to become even more condensed, and the power it exuded became even more astonishing. The terror of this fist affected the surroundings as if it had turned into a black hole. Of course, compared to a black hole, this fist was worlds apart. However, it was enough to shock Chenzong. It was as if all his attacks would be absorbed, and it was difficult to be effective. Infinite. Chapter 1582. Limitless Sword. Limitless Sword. This sword was limitless, with infinite changes and infinite possibilities. Of course, with Chenzong's current realm and attainments, he could not reach the true limitless realm, but he already had the embryonic form. With one sword, he immediately passed Sacred King Chongshan's Chongshan fist. The sword light seemed to have drawn an arc. It was beautiful and gorgeous, unavoidable. Sacred King Chongshan was shocked, but he could not think of a way to resolve this sword. He could not dodge it. That sword was too mysterious. It had already surpassed his Chongshan fist. The sword light flew, and blood shot out from Sacred King Chongshan's throat. Sacred King Chongshan's body flickered and reappeared on the throne. Chenzong was slightly stunned. What did this mean? Your sword is very strong. Sacred King Chongshan did not get up this time. Instead, he touched his neck as if the wound from the sword was still there. At the same cultivation level, I'm inferior to you. Although it was not a pleasant thing to admit that he was inferior to the other party, Sacred King Chongshan still said it bluntly. You're also very strong, Chenzong said. This was not a compliment but a fact. Sacred King Chongshan was really strong. The power of each punch was astonishing, containing terrifying mysteries, like the mysteries of mountains. Especially the last Chongshan fist, its mysteries were even more shocking. Chenzong had gained something from blocking Sacred King Chongshan's last punch. Congratulations on passing the Chongshan Palace. You can go to the next palace. Do you have any questions? Sacred King Chongshan said with a smile. May I ask if you're Sacred King Chongshan's clone? Chenzong was very curious. After all, the other party was very intelligent. It was as if he was facing the real Sacred King Chongshan. However, Chenzong was sure that the person in front of him was not Sacred King Chongshan's true body, but it was definitely related to him. Yes and no. Sacred King Chongshan laughed heartily and did not explain further. You'll know later. In other words, Chenzong would understand after he finished the king-naming pagoda. Goodbye. Chenzong cupped his fists at Sacred King Chongshan. Soon after, a door opened, leading to the next hall. The second palace was called the Covered Palace. It was led by Saint King Covered, who was ranked 13th on the 9-colored king title tablet. The moment Saint King Fuhai attacked, his aura was majestic. It was as if the ocean was overturned. It was mighty and majestic, and it was much more powerful than Saint King Chongshan. It was abnormally terrifying. When Chenzong fought with Sacred King Chongshan, Sacred King Chongshan did not use his force field. It was unknown if he did not cultivate it or if he did not use it at that time. But in fact, Sacred King Chongshan had the force field, but he did not use it. It was not that he could not use it, but at that time, when Chenzong was fighting, he was unwilling to use it and only used his ultimate move to determine the winner. However, Sage King Fu Hai used his force field. Chenzong could only use his force field, or else it would be difficult for him to resist. The battle was extremely intense. Although Sacred King Fu Hai was slightly stronger than Sacred King Chongshan, he was ultimately defeated by Chenzong. Chenzong also gained something from his battle with Sage King Fu Hai. After passing the second palace, Chenzong strode toward the third palace. 7th Palace. 9th Heaven Palace. In the palace, sword lights were dazzling and countless sounds of swords clashing rang out. Sparks flew like the most dazzling fireworks, dazzling everyone. Chen Zong wielded a sword, and so did his opponent. This person wore a silver sword robe with lightning patterns on it. His expression was cold, and there seemed to be arcs of lightning dancing in his eyes. The ninth Heaven Sword King was ranked 8th on the 9-colored King bestowment tablet. He was also a peerless genius who suppressed an era. Chen Zong was more interested in fighting with this person. This was because the 9th Heaven Sword King practiced the sword. Chen Zong was always more eager to fight against someone who excelled in sword technique. The two swords clashed. The 9th Heaven Sword King's cultivation was the same as Chen Zong's, early 7th Heaven Saint realm. This seemed to be the rule of the King Naming Tower. The peerless geniuses of each generation fought in the King Naming Tower across countless spaces. They would fight with the same cultivation, and the rest would depend on their own abilities. Simply put, the ages of these peerless geniuses were not much different. After all, they had all come to challenge the tower within 10 years after breaking through to the Saint realm. The 9th Heaven Sword King's sword contained an extremely strong power of lightning, and his lightning Dao intent was also very powerful and brilliant. The power of this lightning Dao intent was very strong, very pure, and very shocking. It was a high-grade Dao intent. Your sword is very good. Next, I'll let you experience my 9th Heaven Imperial Lightning Sword technique. As soon as the 9th Heaven Sword King's voice fell, the sword hummed with a flick of his finger, and the lightning suddenly shot out as if it was about to burst. It seemed to be a stab, but also like a slash, but whether it was a stab or a slash, it was just a feeling. The power of this sword was unparalleled. It was as if lightning from the 9th Heaven had struck down, wanting to break, collapse, and shatter everything into powder and disappear from this world. The horrifying power of this sword immediately shocked Chen Zong to the extreme. It was very powerful. Chen Zong slashed out with his sword. The sword light was endless, layer upon layer, like rolling waves, like gusts of wind, like clouds of smoke rising in spirals. Countless sword lights were endless. When the terrifying lightning sword light that was full of destructive power arrived, it seemed to have fallen into a swamp. Its speed slowed down, and its power was weakened layer by layer. When this sword arrived in front of Chen Zong swung his sword and directly shattered it. Limitless. With a flash of sword light, it shot towards the 9th Heaven Sword King. This sword had a profound charm, shuttling between existence and nothingness. The 9th Heaven Sword King did not dodge. The lightning became more and more intense, instantly filling the air and pouring out. 9th Heaven Imperial Lightning Sword Technique. Second move. The lightning became agile in an instant, but it did not lose its tyrannical power. When the sword slashed out, the lightning seemed to be able to shatter everything. Its power was even more astonishing. Then, the 9th Heaven Sword King immediately urged the last of his strength to perform the third move, which was also the last move. 9th Heaven Imperial Lightning. Majestic, mighty, domineering, violent. Everything was condensed in this sword. The last sword had boundless power, as if it was a lightning trial that struck down from the 9 Heavens realm. It was impossible to dodge and also difficult to resist. Chen Zong's expression was grave. The power of this move was beyond imagination. Because this sword had a kind of astonishing concept. Limitless. Limitless sword. Limitless sword. After experiencing several intense battles, Chen Zong repeatedly performed the limitless sword. Its essence continued to deepen, its profundity became deeper and deeper, and its power became more and more tyrannical. This was a sword that was filled with infinite possibilities. Kill. Under the limitless sword, it was as if it could transform into 10,000 sword. 10,000 was an imaginary number, representing countless. But the power of the 9th Heaven Sword King's sword was tyrannical to the extreme, terrifying to the extreme. It could shatter everything between heaven and earth, only destruction. This time, the limitless sword was unable to kill the Ninth Heaven Sword King. In an instant, the Ninth Heaven Sword King displayed the 10,000 blades force field. Immediately, countless lightning turned into sword blades, terrifying to the extreme. There were no less than 100 of them, and each of them was extremely sharp, as if a divine sword was piercing through the air. Chen Zong seemed to be facing the encirclement of hundreds of sword experts at the same time. Although they were not as good as the Ninth Heaven Sword King, under the encirclement, their power was astonishing. Coupled with the Ninth Heaven Sword King's attack, Chen Zong was at a disadvantage in an instant. Chen Zong was not afraid in the face of danger, and the 10,000 streams force field was displayed in an instant. After these few years, Chen Zong had also cultivated the 10,000 streams force field to the small success stage. It covered a radius of 1,000 meters and controlled 100 torrents. 100 invisible torrents instantly condensed and surged out, entangling the 100 blades. In this way, the power of the 10,000 blades force field and the 10,000 streams force field cancelled each other out, and there was no suppression or amplification. Chen Zong and the Ninth Heaven Sword King approached each other and engaged in close combat. But in close combat, the Ninth Heaven Sword King immediately fell into a disadvantage. Infinite Sword Chain was a sword technique suitable for close combat. Its power was astonishing to the extreme. In close combat, it became even more terrifying. While the Ninth Heaven Sword King's 9 Heaven Imperial Thunder Sword art was astonishing, but it was more suitable for a certain distance to be able to unleash its strongest power. However, the Ninth Heaven Sword King's sword technique was indeed very brilliant. Each sword was like a thunderbolt tearing through the sky, incomparably tyrannical. For a moment, even though the Ninth Heaven Sword King fell into a slight disadvantage, there was a feeling that he could reverse the situation and suppress Chen Zong at any time. This made Chen Zong have no choice but to focus all of his attention to deal with it, lest he be suppressed instead. And this feeling was like walking on a tightrope. Below was a mountain of blades in hell. It was incomparably astonishing, making his mind and will become increasingly focused and condensed. This battle lasted for a moment. Even though he suppressed the Ninth Heaven Sword King, he was unable to defeat him. His tenacity was astonishing. But after this battle, Chen Zong had basically grasped the Ninth Heaven Sword King's sword technique. There was no need to continue fighting. Heart Domain. In an instant, Chen Zong displayed his Heart Domain. That's right, in the battle just now, from the first hall to the 8th hall now, Chen Zong had never displayed his Heart Domain. In these few years, Chen Zong's strength had increased by a lot, becoming even more tyrannical. After all, he had been fighting with the void demons, wandering between life and death time and time again, brushing past the edge of life and death. The stimulation of his own potential was extremely astonishing. His heart domain had also expanded from the original 1,000 meters to 2,000 meters. Immediately, Chen Zong compressed his heart domain to 1,000 meters, the same size as the myriad stream's force field. Moreover, the 1,000-meter heart domain and the myriad stream's force field merged into one. In an instant, the 100 torrents in the myriad stream's force field were affected, seemingly increasing in power. Originally, one torrent could only contend against one sword blade. Now, one torrent was enough to contend against 2 sword blades. In this way, there were 50 torrents under Chen Zong's control, rapidly rushing towards the Ninth Heaven Sword King, entangling and binding him. In just an instant, the Ninth Heaven Sword King was unable to move. When he erupted with all his strength to break free from the torrent's binding, the limitless sword transformed into a wisp of sword light and attacked. In front of the Ninth Heaven Sword King's eyes, that sword light seemed to be condensed from countless sword lights. It filled his eyes as if it was endless, and there was no way to dodge. When the endless sword light disappeared, The ninth Heaven Sword King's throat was also pierced through. Killed in one sword. Of course, the ninth Heaven Sword King would not truly die here, but it also meant that the ninth Heaven Sword King had lost to Chunzong's sword. Are you willing to learn the Nine Heavens Imperial Lightning Sword art? The ninth Heaven Sword King appeared on the throne, but asked, causing Chunzong to be slightly surprised. After the monstrous geniuses of the previous halls were defeated by him, they all spoke differently, but none of them were like the ninth Heaven Sword King, who wanted to teach him martial arts. It's my honor. Chunzong naturally would not refuse. Chapter 1583. The Nine Heavens Lightning Controlling Sword Technique had 3 moves. The first move was the weakest, and the third move was the strongest. But even the first move was extremely profound and shocking. This sword technique was created by the Nine Heavens Sword King when he was young, combining many sword techniques with his own Thunder Dao intent. After continuous refinement, it reached its peak. It was a profound sword technique that could fully unearth the power and potential of the Thunder Dao intent. Chunzong's comprehension was astonishing, and the Nine Heavens Sword King taught him without holding back. He quickly grasped the profundity of it, which was even more shocking. Not only could the Nine Heavens Lightning Controlling Sword Technique fully unearth the power and potential of the Thunder Dao intent, it was also a sword technique that cultivated the Thunder Dao intent. Under continuous cultivation, it could transform the Thunder Dao intent. With an even faster speed, it transformed from low-grade to mid-grade, from mid-grade to high-grade, and then from high-grade to top-grade 9 Heavenly Thunder Dao Insight. Only by using the Nine Heavens Lightning Dao intent to activate the Nine Heavens Lightning Controlling Sword technique could its power be raised to the extreme. Chunzong had already seen its power. In fact, the Nine Heavens Sword King's talent couldn't be considered outstanding. At least in his era, there was more than one person whose talent surpassed his. But in the end, it was the Nine Heavens Sword King who detonated the nine-colored heavenly flower. Therefore, the Nine Heavens Sword King worked very hard and gave his all. In the end, he made a qualitative change and stood at the top of his generation. The flow of time inside and outside the king-naming pagoda was different. A long time passed inside, but only a short time passed outside. Chunzong wasn't in a hurry to enter the ninth hall. Instead, he cultivated the Nine Heavens Lightning Controlling Sword technique in the 8th hall. The Nine Heavens Sword King even personally fed Chunzong moves, allowing Chunzong to grasp the essence of the Nine Heavens Lightning Controlling Sword technique in the shortest amount of time. It had to be said that the Nine Heavens Sword King's actions made Chunzong very moved. Therefore, he practiced even more diligently. The first move, Thunder Boom, was mastered. With a sword strike, lightning flashed, instantly condensing an extremely terrifying power. It was extremely shocking, as if it wanted to destroy everything. The second move, Thunder Flash, not only did it have the tyrannical power of Lei Hong, it also had the agility and speed that Lei Hong didn't have. Once the sword was unleashed, it would instantly reach its target. As for the third move, Nine Heavens Imperial Thunder, it was a unique move. Chunzong couldn't master it in a short time because it was too difficult. The concept of this move was very high, like the divine thunder above the 9 heavens. Your Lightning Dao Insight is only an intermediate grade Dao Insight, and only by transforming into a high-grade Dao Insight would you be able to grasp the 9 Heavens Imperial Lightning. The 9 Heavens Sword King spoke unhurriedly. "Thank you for teaching me." Chunzong saluted with his sword. Although the 9 Firmament Sword King in front of him was in his youth, he was countless years older than him. It was not an exaggeration to call him a senior. "I hope you can pass down the 9 Heavens Imperial Thunder Sword art," the 9 Heavens Sword King said. This was also the reason why he passed it down to Chunzong. Okay. Chunzong's answer was simple, but it was an agreement between swordsmen. Since he couldn't master the third move for the time being, Chunzong didn't force it. The Nine Heavens Imperial Thunder Sword art was indeed a shocking sword art, but Chunzong wouldn't use it as his main sword art. He would only absorb its essence and profundity to perfect his own sword art and sword Dao, gathering the strengths of hundreds of schools and fusing them into his own sword to achieve supreme achievement. This was Chunzong's sword Dao. Besides that, the Nine Heavens lightning controlling sword technique allowed one to cultivate lightning Dao insight, and it allowed one's lightning Dao insight to transform into a high-grade Dao insight even faster. It was even to the extent that it could transform into the top-grade Nine Heavens lightning Dao insight in the future. If possible, fight the Sword Emperor, the Nine Heavens Sword King said. This was his goal in the past, but unfortunately, he couldn't achieve it. Okay. Chunzong nodded again. Not only did he have to fight the Sword Emperor, but he also had to fight the Linwu Emperor. He didn't know how powerful the young Linwu Emperor was. The eighth palace was called Dustless Palace. After a fierce battle, Chunzong defeated the Dustless Saint King with his Heart Domain and Wanlu Force Field. He entered the ninth palace. The ninth palace was called Divine Light Palace. The person in charge was the Divine Light Saint King. The Divine Light Saint King's speed was shocking. Whether it was the speed of his body movement or his attack, it was terrifying. Before people could react, they were already defeated and killed. But Chunzong's heart domain was compressed, and the Divine Light Saint King's speed was captured. The Divine Light Saint King was most proud of his speed. With his terrifying speed, he defeated many geniuses and was ranked 6th on the 9-colored monarch bestowment tablet. But against Chunzong, the Divine Light Saint King's speed couldn't unleash its full power. In the end, he was defeated by Chunzong. Even so, Chunzong was shocked by the Divine Light Saint King's speed. If he hadn't mastered the heart domain, he probably wouldn't have been a match for him. The 10th palace was called Black Region Palace. It was guarded by the Black Region Saint King. After exchanging blows with the Black Region Saint King, Chunzong understood why the Divine Light Saint King couldn't defeat him. The Black Region Saint King's cultivation technique was terrifying. Once he activated it, it was as if his body was turning into a black hole. It enveloped the surroundings, as if he wanted to control everything. No matter how fast one would be affected. Moreover, every attack of the Black Region Saint King was extremely powerful. It was like a black hole that automatically absorbed everything around it. It could be said that every attack of the Black Region Saint King contained the mysteries of the Heavy Mountain Fist. It affected Chunzong's sword. Unknowingly, its power was offset and weakened, making it difficult for him to hit his opponent. This level of martial arts. Chunzong was secretly shocked. He felt that the Black Region Saint King's martial arts seemed to be a combination of martial arts and force field. Its power was shocking. But he didn't know how the Black Region Saint King was able to combine martial arts and force fields. This was also the reason why the Blackfield Sage King was able to reign supreme in his generation. This battle was difficult. Chunzong performed his swordsmanship to the extreme. He also performed his myriad streams force field to the extreme. Combined with his heart domain, the battle continued. Every time they clashed, Chunzong was searching for the mysteries of the Black Region Saint King's martial arts. Fight, fight, fight. One sword was infinite. Under the combination of the myriad streams force field and heart domain, Chunzong cancelled out the power of the Black Region Saint King's Black Region. The infinite sword was endless. It was so profound that the Black Region Saint King was exhausted. Then the sword light flashed and tore the Black Region Saint King's throat. The terrifying sword chi entered and killed him in one strike. This battle was very difficult, but he won in the end. The 11th palace was a new palace called the Ancient Xian Palace. It was the palace where the Ancient Xian Saint King was in charge. The Ancient Xian Saint King was the Taishian Saint. I didn't expect you to make it here. The Taishian Saint King sat high on the throne and looked down. When he saw Chunzong, He was first surprised, then smiled coldly. Chen Zong was also surprised. The Taishan Saint King had made it here and ranked fourth on the 9-colored monarch title tablet. "This is your end," the Taishan Saint King said again. "You can try," Chen Zong replied calmly. Then Chen Zong was confused. The Taishan Saint King here was obviously not the Taishan Saint King himself. Perhaps it was a trick of the monarch title tower, but he had all of the Taishan Saint King's memories and emotions. It was really strange. Fight. The Taishan Saint King attacked immediately. He wasn't testing. He used his full strength. He unsheathed his long sword and the sword light tore through the sky. This sword seemed to split the sky and the earth. It was extremely powerful and terrifying. It seemed that nothing in the world could resist it. The extreme edge sword was unsheathed, and the extreme edge sword slashed out, its sharpness unparalleled. The Taishan heaven and earth skill was fully activated. A dim shadow of the sky and the earth condensed. The heavy Xian force field was used. The two seemed to merge into one. The second sword followed, and its power was many times stronger. Slash, slash, slash. As soon as he unsheathed his sword, the Taishan Saint King exploded with shocking strength and attacked mercilessly. The sword intent was like the might of the heavens. It cut through the sky and the earth. Chen Zong had fought with the Taishan Saint King before. After a fierce battle, there was no clear winner. However, the Taishan Saint King hadn't used his full strength at that time, while Chen Zong had. Now that a few years had passed, Chen Zong's cultivation and strength had improved greatly. However, the Taishan Saint King's cultivation and strength had also improved greatly. Therefore, Chen Zong wasn't confident that he could defeat the Taishan Saint King. After all, the Taishan Saint King's cultivation was in the early 8th Heaven Saint realm. He was one realm higher than Chen Zong. The Taishan Saint King's cultivation method was also more powerful than Chen Zong's great mystery art. However, the Taishan Saint King in front of him had the same cultivation as him. Chen Zong didn't think that he would lose to the Taishan Saint King. Fight. Myriad Streams Force Field. Heart Domain. He also fully activated the Great Mystery Art. He had already reached the 28th level. He wasn't far from the 30th level. This level was only one level lower than the Taishan Saint King's 29th level. He was gradually catching up. Although the Taishan Saint King's cultivation was the same as his, Chen Zong realized that the Taishan Saint King's strength was terrifying. However, the Taishan Saint King was able to defeat so many strong opponents and rank fourth on the 9-colored monarch bestowment tablet. After all, Chen Zong had fought with those monstrous geniuses before. He deeply knew how powerful those monstrous geniuses were. Although he had defeated them one by one, the process hadn't been easy. The Taishan Saint King was able to defeat them with the same cultivation as him, which showed how powerful he was. Now, the Taishan Saint King had become a formidable opponent. What Chen Zong needed to do was to defeat and kill the Taishan Saint King and then challenge the Eternal Night Demon Lord. The Demon Emperor Eternal Night. One could imagine how powerful the Eternal Night Demon Lord was since the Taishan Saint King had been defeated. What about the Sword Emperor, who was ranked above the Eternal Night Demon Lord? How shocking would it be to use the title of Sword Emperor without any prefixes? How terrifying was the Sword Emperor's sword technique? Chen Zong was looking forward to it. How shocking was the Lingwu Emperor, who was ranked first and had never been surpassed by anyone since ancient times. However, the prerequisite for all this was to defeat the Taishan Saint King first. Then, to defeat the real Taishan Saint King, he would have to start with the Taishan Saint King before him. Countless sparks flew as the saber and sword clashed. Both Chen Zong and the Taishan Saint King were determined to kill each other. They didn't know the previous monstrous genius Chen Zong, but the Taishan Saint King had a grudge against Chen Zong. To a certain extent, they were enemies. Even if the death here wasn't real death, they had to kill each other regardless of the reason. Chapter 1584. Dark Ancient Palace. The Taishian Saint's son performed his saber skills to the extreme, but he could not defeat Chen Zong. On the contrary, he was gradually suppressed by Chen Zong and was at a disadvantage. The Taishian Saint's son could not believe it. How could he be suppressed when they were at the same cultivation level? However, this was the truth. He was really suppressed. Not only could his gravity force field not defeat his opponent, but it was also cancelled out by his opponent's force field. He felt that his opponent's force field was only at the initial level, while his was at the great level. After many years of cultivation, the Taishian Saint's son had indeed cultivated his gravity force field to the great level, and its power was even more shocking. If not for the help of the Heart Realm, his myriad stream's force field would have been suppressed by his opponent's gravity force field. When the forces used to suppress each other collided, the side with the higher cultivation level would have the upper hand. The other side would naturally be weakened or even suppressed. However, with the help of the Heart Realm, the power of the myriad stream's force field doubled. The infinite sword chain continued to dissolve the Taishian Saint's son's shocking broadsword techniques in close combat. It also continued to counterattack. Layer upon layer, the Taishian Saint's son gradually felt tired of dealing with it. This was especially so during the constant battles. Chen Zong had a flash of inspiration. He had subconsciously fused the mysteries of the 9 lines that he had comprehended from the Jade Wall on the 8th level of the valley into the Infinity Sword Chain. This caused the Infinity Sword Chain to have even more variations. They were all linked together and were even more difficult to deal with. The Infinite Sword Chain had been perfected by Chen Zong again and again. Now it could be divided into 2 parts. The first part was the Infinity Sword Chain. When the sword was drawn, the Infinity Sword would chain endlessly. It was a sword technique that was most suitable for close combat. It was a masterpiece that combined attack, defense, technique, and so on. It was the most profound and was the essence of Chen Zong's sword technique. The second part was the ultimate move. It was the chain, the infinite, and the infinite. It was also the 3 realms of the infinite sword chain. The chain was meant to weaken and was a defensive move. The infinite was meant to be a skill and was both offensive and defensive. The infinite was meant to be an offensive move. This was also the result of Chen Zong gradually integrating the mysteries of the 9 layers of the Jade Wall into the fierce battles with generations of peerless geniuses. Or rather, it was a kind of enlightenment that became even clearer. Every bit of comprehension and the essence of the opponent's martial arts during the battle would be absorbed by himself and fused into the infinite sword chain, constantly perfecting and improving it. Chen Zong didn't expect himself to create the infinite sword chain by chance during the fierce battle with the heavens chosen from the vast wilderness. He didn't think too much about it at that time, but now he was gradually perfecting it. It had a profound meaning and surpassed the lifeless sword style and so on. Clearly, the infinite sword chain could continuously absorb the essence of martial arts, constantly improve and constantly break through the limit. The Taishian Saint's long saber pierced through the air. Saber light flashed out continuously, turning into an astonishing majestic beam. The blade radiance was like the Milky Way pouring down from the sky. Although it was weakened by Chen Zong's successive sword strikes, it seized the opportunity to retreat in an instant. In an instant, an extremely terrifying aura burst out from the Taishian Saint's body. Not only was the aura extremely tyrannical, but it also had an indescribable mystery that made Chen Zong's hair stand on end. Heaven and earth void. The saber slashed out as if the void was split by it. An extremely terrifying power invaded, causing Chen Zong's soul to tremble. Superpower. This was clearly a minor divine ability. This minor superpower was the Taishan Saint's strongest trump card. The saber slashed out with endless power. It was a Space Series superpower and was extremely terrifying. Everything would be split open. Chunzong knew that with his current strength, he couldn't resist it at all. The power of Lingwu exploded in an instant. The strength of the power of Lingwu was closely related to one's qi and body refinement cultivation. After many years, Chunzong's qi refinement cultivation had improved to the early 7th heaven saint rudiment stage. His body refinement cultivation had also improved a lot, reaching the early 5th heaven chaotic heaven realm. Although it was still not as good as his qi refinement cultivation, it was much higher than before. The power of Lingwu condensed from this was naturally stronger than before. In the past, the power of Lingwu could increase the power of Chunzong's qi refinement cultivation from the late 5th heaven saint rudiment stage to the late 6th heaven saint rudiment stage, but it couldn't increase the power of Chunzong's qi refinement cultivation from the early 7th heaven saint rudiment stage to the early 8th heaven saint rudiment stage. After all, the higher the cultivation, the purer the saint power, and the more difficult it would be to increase it. However, the power of Lingwu now could increase the power of Chunzong's qi refinement cultivation to the early 8th heaven saint rudiment stage, which was a full level increase. Chunzong slashed out with his sword under the tyrannical basic strength. Limitless. This was the most tyrannical sword move that Chunzong had mastered. Kill. The sword light seemed to be one, but it also seemed to be endless. Every sword strike carried a terrifying power. The sword lights were annihilated one after another, but more sword lights were created. Then, as if man and sword had become one, Chunzong instantly passed through the terrifying spatial crack and attacked the Taishan Saint Sun. This sword strike was unparalleled and directly crushed the Taishan Saint Sun. The Taishan Saint Sun was pierced through and died in one strike. The Taishan Saint Sun reappeared on the throne and stared coldly at Chunzong. He clenched his fist and blue veins popped out. He was very unwilling to admit defeat. He had used a lesser superpower, but he still lost. According to the rules of the King Naming Pagoda, he couldn't attack again. Chunzong knew very well how difficult it was to defeat the Taishan Saint Sun. After all, Chunzong hadn't detonated the power of Lingwu in the previous legendary geniuses. That strike was extremely terrifying. Those legendary geniuses couldn't resist it. If Chunzong hadn't detonated the power of Lingwu to strengthen his basic strength, he probably wouldn't have been able to resist it and would have been killed in one strike. However, that was a lesser superpower, and his power of Lingwu was also a lesser superpower. Although Chunzong had defeated the Taishan Saint Sun, he wasn't happy because he hadn't defeated the real Taishan Saint Sun. The real Taishan Saint Sun's cultivation was at the early stage of the 8th level Saint Rudiment realm, not the early stage of the 7th level Saint Rudiment realm. The difference of one level in cultivation meant the difference in their basic strength was huge. If Chunzong fought the real Taishan Saint Sun with his current strength, he wasn't confident at all that he could defeat him. This wasn't self-denial. It was the truth. The lesser superpower used by the early stage of the 8th level Saint Rudiment realm and the early stage of the 7th level Saint Rudiment realm were completely different. The possibility of Chunzong's infinite sword strike being blocked was very small. Therefore, defeating the real Taishan Saint Sun wasn't something to be proud of. However, Chunzong had seen the Taishan Saint Sun's strength in this battle. If he had fought the real Taishan Saint Sun, he would have been more confident. Moreover, he had gained a lot from this battle. He stepped forward and walked to the next palace. The 12th Palace, Eternal Night Palace. The palace master of the Eternal Night Palace was a legendary genius from the same era as the Emperor of Lingwu, the Eternal Night Demon Lord. Although his ranking wasn't as high as the Lingwu Emperor, he was the Emperor of Lingwu's greatest opponent in that era. Although he couldn't defeat the Emperor of Lingwu each time, It wasn't easy for the Emperor of Lingwu to defeat him either. The light in the Eternal Night Palace was slightly dim. A black-robed, long-haired figure leaned against a huge throne with his eyes closed. He seemed to be in a deep sleep. Chenzong stepped forward. He glanced around and stared ahead. In the blink of an eye, his closed eyes opened, and an indescribable darkness shot out from the depths of his eyes. Chenzong only felt that the surrounding space seemed to have become even darker in an instant, and there was a feeling of darkness invading him. Furthermore, the darkness and depth contained within those eyes made her heart palpitate incomparably at that moment. In an instant, an indescribable feeling of fear emerged from the depths of his heart. It was just a gaze. Fortunately, Chenzong's soul was strong, and his will was incomparably tough. He was only slightly affected. He quickly reacted and resisted. Even so, Chenzong was still shocked. A formidable opponent. A formidable opponent even more terrifying than the Tai Xian Saint's son. "You use a sword?" A slightly hoarse voice sounded. The dark gaze also fell on the long sword at Chenzong's waist. Immediately, Chenzong only felt that the other party's gaze was emitting an incomparably terrifying murderous aura. "I hate people who use swords. They all deserve to die." As soon as his voice fell, without any movement, a terrifying pitch-black aura shot through the sky. It was so fast and sudden that it was impossible to guard against it. Chenzong was already prepared. He unsheathed his extreme-edge sword and tore through the sky. The sword chi was astonishing and brilliant. The sword chi dissipated and the pitch-black aura shattered. The Eternal Night Demon Lord's body suddenly flew up and turned into a flash of black light. He attacked at an astonishing speed. Fast. Extremely fast. Although in terms of absolute speed, he was not as fast as the Divine Light Saint King, the burst of speed in an instant was extremely shocking. And not only was it simply fast, but it was also incomparably mysterious. Chenzong could not catch its trajectory. Heart Domain. Without hesitation, Chenzong released his heart domain in an instant and compressed it to 50 meters. The Eternal Night Demon Lord also entered the range of the 50-meter heart domain in an instant. Only then did Chenzong catch his trajectory. Myriad streams force field. Hundreds of torrents rushed over in an instant, but the Eternal Night Demon Lord was completely aware of it. He directly dodged the torrents with a terrifying murderous aura. It was like a demonic blade that tore through the sky. The murderous aura was astonishing and terrifying. It made Chenzong's hair stand on end. This kind of terrifying feeling was simply indescribable with words. Tyrannical. Incomparably tyrannical. More terrifying than any of the previous peerless geniuses. This was the peerless genius ranked third on the 9-colored monarch bestowment tablet. The Eternal Night Demon Lord. The black light arrived in an instant, making Chenzong's hair stand on end. But the extreme edge sword still slashed out. It was the extreme heart sword style, which was astonishingly fast. This sword had only pierced through a patch of black light, but it had not truly pierced through it. This feeling of hitting air immediately gave Chenzong a bad premonition. The seventh step of the thunder-trampling 9 heavens. In an instant, the lightning flashed and was cut in half by an incomparably sharp black light. Just a little bit more and he would have been killed by that extremely terrifying attack. Since the first attack did not hit, the second black light came again. It was extremely terrifying. Chain. The sword light overlapped and was endless. In an instant it enveloped the black light. This amazing mystery immediately weakened the black light layer by layer, as if it had fallen into a swamp. But the black light was also extremely sharp. It broke through the chain of sword light and attacked Chenzong with unparalleled murderous intent. Chapter 1585. Votes, votes, that's power. Brothers, quickly transfer your power to the 6th Tao. Wuji. A sword strike that was even more exquisite than the chain attack was unleashed. It looked like one sword, but it was actually made up of many swords. Wuji displayed an unparalleled and shocking skill. Instantly, the black light was broken, and it attacked the Eternal Night Demon Lord from all directions. The Eternal Night Demon Lord was indeed amazing, but Chen Zong was not to be underestimated either. Under Wuji's sword, the black light that the Eternal Night Demon Lord had transformed into instantly became scorching hot. It was as if a black sun had exploded. Wuji's sword light was completely blocked and shattered in an instant. Eternal Night. A low and hoarse voice suddenly rang out from the black sun. It contained shocking Taoist rhyme fluctuations that swept out in all directions. Immediately, a terrifying black light exploded, covering the sky and earth. It wreaked havoc in all directions as if it was swallowing all light. In an instant, the entire Eternal Night Palace was plunged into darkness. One could not even see one's own fingers. Not only could they not see anything, they could not hear anything, and they could not smell anything. In just an instant, Chen Zong felt that his 5 senses were completely blocked. It was as if they were sealed. Not only were his 5 senses robbed, even his 6th sense was greatly affected. There was a deviation in his perception. The further he was, the blurrier it was. It was difficult to make an accurate judgment. Previously, when the Taishan Saint challenged the Eternal Night Demon Lord, he was defeated by this shocking darkness that robbed his 5 senses and blurred his 6th sense. He could not see or hear anything. Even his perception was greatly disrupted and became very blurry. It was as if he had become a blind person. He felt like he was at the mercy of others. Although Chen Zong was surprised, he did not panic. Instead, he closed his eyes. He could not see left or right. Fortunately, it was better to close his eyes. His heart domain was further compressed until the limit was 10 meters. Within 10 meters, the darkness seemed to fade. Even if he did not use his eyes, Chen Zong could clearly see it. The darkness was still there. Eternal night existed forever, but it could no longer blur Chen Zong's perception. Could only affect it slightly, and this effect was not big for Chen Zong. Compressing a heart domain of 2,000 meters into 10 meters, the compression ratio was even greater and even more shocking. A blurry figure covered in black light instantly charged into the range of 10 meters. The extremely terrifying black light stretched out like a saber light tearing apart the heaven and earth. It was silent and incomparably terrifying. If Chen Zong didn't have the domain of heart, he wouldn't have been able to withstand this attack under Evernight. Even if he didn't die, he would have been gravely injured. But now, the Eternal Night Devil Lord didn't know the profoundness of Chen Zong's heart domain. This was an excellent opportunity. Limitless. Chen Zong's silhouette flickered as he evaded the attack by a hair's breadth. He then countered with a sword strike. It was a limitless sword strike, and its might was extremely shocking. The Eternal Night Demon Lord indeed didn't know the profoundness of Chen Zong's heart domain. He was very surprised by Chen Zong's dodging and counterattack. However, the Eternal Night Demon Lord was very strong. He immediately reacted and attacked Infinite Sword with a blade-like black light. That pitch-black light was like a demon descending into the world. It was incomparable. It was clearly just a saber, but it covered the sky and covered the earth, as if it filled up a part of the world. It blocked Infinite Sword completely. This was the first time Chen Zong's Infinite Sword was completely ineffective since the start of the intense battle. Could such a powerful Eternal Night Demon Lord be defeated? Chen Zong didn't know and didn't think too much about it. At this moment, Chen Zong only had one thought, and that was to fight to the death with the Eternal Night Demon Lord. The Eternal Night Demon Lord's strength was extremely high, and his talent was even more shocking. The black light was like a saber. While its power was tyrannical, it was also very terrifying and mysterious. It seemed like there was no obvious weakness, and it was extremely difficult to deal with. If it wasn't for the heart domain, Chernzong would have been defeated long ago. The Eternal Night Demon Lord's Eternal Night Demon technique was an extremely terrifying technique. It was cultivated to the highest level, and its power was astonishing. When a technique was cultivated to the highest level, its power would increase greatly. If Chernzong cultivated the Dexian formula to the 30th level, he would also be able to grasp the true meaning of the technique, and its power would increase greatly. Unfortunately, it wasn't so easy to cultivate a technique to the highest level, especially if it was a saint-level technique. The fact that the Eternal Night Demon Lord could cultivate the top Eternal Night Demon technique to the highest level at a young age showed his shocking talent. In this aspect, Chernzong really couldn't compare to him. Every peerless genius of the same generation had their own strength. The higher ones ranking on the 9-colored monarch bestowment tablet, the more shocking it was. When the highest level of the Eternal Night Demon technique was fully activated, it created an eternal night, depriving one's 5 senses and blurring one's 6th sense. This was an extremely disadvantageous battle environment for the enemy, but it was very advantageous for the Eternal Night Demon Lord. However, the Eternal Night environment didn't seem to have much effect on this person. This made the Eternal Night Demon Lord puzzled. However, this puzzlement didn't affect the Eternal Night Demon Lord's strength. He had experienced countless battles and encountered almost all kinds of situations. When he challenged the Monarch Bestowment Tower, he was originally number 1. A few years later, when the Lingwu Emperor rose, he was defeated by the Lingwu Emperor. Then, he was defeated by the Sword Emperor. It was because he was defeated by the Sword Emperor that he didn't like people who practiced the sword. Until now, only the Lingwu Emperor and the Sword Emperor could ignore his Eternal Night Demon Lord. Now there was one more. No matter what, he had to defeat and kill this junior. He was a Demon Lord who reigned supreme in an era. Even the Lingwu Emperor was only slightly stronger than him. How could a mere junior be so arrogant in front of him? The fierce battle continued. Chernzong noticed that the Eternal Night Demon Lord's weapon was a blade. It was a pitch-black long blade, and the back of the blade was covered with sinister barbs and serrated teeth. It was extremely terrifying and emitted an extremely shocking killing intent. Every slash seemed to be made with his full strength. When combined with the Eternal Night Devil art, its power was terrifying. Every slash was incomparably mysterious. It was as if nothing could change, and nothing could change into anything. Chernzong felt a sense of exhaustion when dealing with it. The Heavenly Demon Dao Intent was a rare Dao Intent that had reached the peak of the Dao Intent. Eternal Night Devil Blade. In an instant, the blade light slashed down like a pitch-black waterfall, shattering everything in its path. Without using the power of the Lingwu realm, Chernzong gradually fell into a disadvantageous position. Although the Eternal Night Demon Lord's cultivation was the same as his, at the early 7th Heaven Saint realm, his cultivation technique had reached the peak of the 7th Heaven Saint realm. Moreover, his top-grade Heavenly Devil Dao insight had even attained the 9th cycle. Comparatively speaking, the might of his Grand Profundity technique was inferior to the Evernight Devil technique, and he'd even only cultivated it to the 28th level. So, his top-grade Heart Sword Dao insight had only attained the 8th cycle. Thus, there was a large gap between them. Fortunately, Chernzong had the Heart Domain, and his attainments in it were not low. Coupled with the Infinite Sword Chain, he was able to resist the Eternal Night Demon Lord's slash. However, if this continued, he would probably have to use the power of the Lingwu realm. However, Chernzong did not want to use the power of the Lingwu realm just yet. In the past few years, his cultivation and Dao intent had improved significantly. However, there were too many aspects that he needed to improve. Therefore, his Heart Sword Dao intent had risen from the 7th revolution to the 8th revolution. However, the Earthly Fire Dao intent, Heavenly Wind Dao intent, and Lightning Dao intent had also improved greatly. All of them had reached the 8th revolution. This time, Chernzong planned to use the pressure of the Eternal Night Demon Lord to suppress his potential and break through again. This was a very dangerous method. However, it was not the first time Chernzong had done it. Using the pressure of the outside world to suppress himself and stimulate his potential, Chernzong was very familiar with this method. The Eternal Night Devil Lord also realized that Qin Wentian seemed to be treating him as a whetstone. This caused him to have bad memories. Back then, the junior of the Sword Emperor was also like this. He broke through under his saber and defeated him instead. Immediately, a ferocious expression appeared on the Eternal Night Demon Lord's face. The darkness in his eyes became deeper and deeper. It filled his pupils and filled everything. It was abnormally terrifying, as if a demon had descended. Chernzong also noticed that traces of black demonic runes appeared on the Eternal Night Demon Lord's face. It was even more terrifying. The pressure increased again. The infinite sword chain was executed to the extreme, and the heart sword Dao intent was also activated to the extreme. 3 years ago, the heart sword Dao intent had broken through from the 7th revolution to the 8th revolution. Now that 3 years had passed, with Chernzong's talent, he had accumulated enough. He was not far from breaking through to the 9th revolution. Chernzong had full confidence that he could successfully break through to the 9th revolution within a year. Right now, he needed to borrow the pressure of the Eternal Night Demon Lord. Eternal Night. Abyss. The Eternal Night Demon Lord erupted with all his strength. With a slash of his blade, black blade light covered the sky and earth. It merged with the Eternal Night True Intent and instantly slashed down. That blade light clearly only slashed down from the front, but it also blended into the surroundings. As long as there was darkness, the blade light would be there. It was everywhere, as if it had become a world. Such profoundness was incomparably profound. This slash was impossible for Chernzong to dodge at all. Even if he had the heart domain to sense it, it was still the same. Because the heart domain could not isolate the darkness of the eternal night, it could only sense it. Infinite. Using offense as defense, he attacked with a sword that surpassed his limit. All his potential was forced out in an instant, exploding out in an instant. In an instant, the heart sword Dao Will, which had already reached the peak, broke through and reached the 9th revolution. The extremely terrifying sharpness seemed to have exploded from the depths of Qin Zong's heart and spewed out. It was like an ancient volcano that buried countless sword qi. Its power was unparalleled. As the heart sword Dao intent broke through to the 9th revolution, its prowess increased tremendously as well. The prowess of the boundless infinitum chain sword had also increased significantly. Working together with the heart domain, it allowed Chernzong to block off the eternal night saber light that was pouring in from all directions. That pitch-black blade light seemed to want to sink Chernzong into the dark abyss. Eternal night. Fall. An even more terrifying blade slashed out again. Its power was even more terrifying than the minor superpower that the Taishian saint had used previously. It made Chernzong extremely terrified. The power of Lingwu. Detonate. In an instant, Chernzong's cultivation power increased explosively. The infinite sword also slashed out in an instant. Because the heart sword Dao Will had broken through to the 9th revolution, this slash became even more terrifying and tyrannical. It was far more powerful than when he had fought with the Taishian saint. This slash seemed to have cut open hell. It was invincible and unstoppable. It tore apart the true intent of the Eternal Night demonic art and attacked the Eternal Night Demon Lord. This slash was indomitable and unstoppable. Chapter 1586. In the Eternal Night Palace, on the throne. The eyes of the Eternal Night Devil Lord were filled with darkness, so dark that the whites of his eyes were completely covered. He stared at Chernzong, causing Chernzong's expression to turn heavy. Defeated. He was actually defeated by a junior, and a junior who used a sword. Anger. Rage. But a defeat was a defeat. According to the rules of the king naming pagoda, he could not attack again. He could only suppress his anger. Chen Zong took a deep breath and looked away. He walked towards the next palace. The Eternal Night Demon Lord was indeed amazing. He was far more powerful than the previous geniuses. This battle was very difficult. The 13th Palace, Sword Sovereign Palace. The person in charge was a genius who came one generation after the Lingwu Emperor, Sword Sovereign. Using the two words, Sword Sovereign, as his title was enough to show that his attainments in the Sword Dao had reached a terrifying level. He had completely gained the recognition of the king naming pagoda. Sword Sovereign, the Sovereign of Swords. How elegant would his sword be? In an instant, Chen Zong adjusted his mentality. He was fearless and full of anticipation as he stepped through the door of the 13th Palace. This step was like two different worlds. Sword Sovereign Palace. There were 14 palaces in the Lingwu Imperial Palace. Every palace looked similar. The only difference was the color and light. The light in the Sword Sovereign Palace was bright and clear. All the items seemed to have traces of golden light flowing around them. They emitted a shocking sharpness that seemed to be sword qi. Chen Zong's eyes narrowed as he stared in front of him. A young man in a pale golden robe was sitting on the throne. He was resting with his eyes closed, but his back was as straight as a sword. He pointed towards the dome of the palace. Endless sword qi radiated in all directions with the throne as the center. It covered everything, including the entire palace. In an instant, the young man on the throne suddenly opened his eyes. It was as if the sword qi was going to pierce through the void and pierce through Chen Zong. This sharpness shocked Chen Zong. However, Chen Zong met his gaze without fear. The aura of the will of the heart sword filled the air. His gaze was like a sword, and his pupils were like rays of light. They collided and collided in the void, as if two swords were clashing. Countless invisible sparks burst forth. You also practice swordsmanship. It sounded like a question, but it was also filled with certainty. The Sword Emperor's attainments in the way of the sword were extremely high. He had already been fully acknowledged by the king naming pagoda and was given the title of Sword Emperor. There was no need to talk about his attainments in the way of the sword. Therefore, the moment he met Chen Zong's eyes, he knew that this person's attainment in the Tao of the sword was very high. He was definitely a sword cultivator. He was a sword cultivator, yet he was able to defeat the Eternal Night Demon Lord and walk up to him. This had already caused the Sword Emperor's emotions to fluctuate slightly, and he was filled with battle intent. Countless years had passed since he ranked second on the 9-colored monarch tablet. He had always been in the Sword Emperor Palace, and no one had ever come before him. Loneliness. Loneliness. Now, there was finally someone who could defeat the Eternal Night Demon Master and walk in front of him. Furthermore, it was a sword cultivator. In an instant, an extremely terrifying sword will shot up into the sky, as if it was going to pierce through the dome of the Sword Emperor Palace. It was mighty and brilliant. Feeling this terrifying and tyrannical sword will, Chen Zong knew why this person was given the title of Sword Emperor. The sword will was upright and brilliant, like the sun shining in the sky, like an emperor descending upon the world. The sword will of the heart sword was also released in an instant, contending with the sword will. Chen Zong's sword will of the heart sword came from the heart and was even more ethereal and difficult to find. However, its intention was far and far, completely different from the Sword Emperor's sword will. The two opposing sword wills clashed with each other, and a terrifying sharpness surged in the Sword Emperor Palace. You and I both practice swordsmanship. Why don't we use the way of the sword to determine who is better? The Sword Emperor stood up, and his dignified sword will seemed to be even stronger. His voice was like an emperor commanding the world, and it spread out mightily. They did not compete in cultivation, secret techniques, or anything else. They only competed in the way of the sword. They competed with swords and used the way of the sword to determine who was better. Chernzong was very agreeable. Please! Chernzong saluted with his sword. Please! The Sword Emperor saluted with his sword. Then, Chernzong stared ahead and locked onto the Sword Emperor. He took a step forward, approaching the Sword Emperor step by step. His aura was constantly condensing, and traces of sword chi permeated around him. It was not sword chi activated by saint energy, but under the influence of the sword will, the surrounding air seemed to have been sharpened and turned into sword chi. The sword chi was awe-inspiring. Under the Sword Emperor's sword will, the surrounding air was also transformed into sword chi. Chernzong's sword will of the heart sword came from the heart, and it was a natural transformation like moving clouds and flowing water. However, the Sword Emperor's heavenly sword will of the Sword Emperor was like an emperor descending upon the world, and all living things submitting to him. Therefore, the aura of their sword chi was different. Ninth Revolution. Chernzong's sword will of the heart sword was at the ninth revolution, and the Sword Emperor's sword will of the heart sword was also at the ninth revolution. Moreover, they were both top-grade Dao wills. Their swords were still in their sheaths, and they were hundreds of meters away from each other. They did not seem to have made a move, but their sword wills had already clashed several times. Under the control of the sword wills, sword chi shot out, colliding and dispersing continuously, and a series of terrifying explosions could be heard. This was a battle between peerless sword cultivators. Their bodies did not move, but their minds moved and sword chi moved. However, the battle of sword wills was evenly matched. The Sword Emperor's heavenly sword will of the Sword Emperor was upright and bright, and it directly oppressed and wanted all living things to submit to it. On the other hand, Chernzong's sword will of the heart sword came from the heart, and it was hard to find and grasp. As if they had a tacit understanding, two beams of sword light shot out in an instant. Man and sword became one, and they crossed hundreds of meters in an instant. The two swords clashed. As promised, both of them did not cultivate their chi, and the Sword Emperor did not cultivate his body. Naturally, Chernzong would not cultivate his body either, and he only used the same strength to control his sword. Sword technique. Sword will. That was all. This was a battle between pure sword cultivators. In just an instant, both of them attacked hundreds of times and clashed hundreds of times. Sword light overflowed in all directions, sword chi surged, and countless sparks blazed. Chernzong was using the basic sword technique, and the Sword Emperor was also using the basic sword technique. The basic sword technique was basically the same as the sword moves and styles. The only difference was the degree of mastery and application. Ordinary sword cultivators had an ordinary foundation in the basic sword technique, and their application was ordinary. Brilliant sword cultivators had an extremely solid foundation in the basic sword technique, and their application was unpredictable, and their power was indescribable. Chernzong and the Sword Emperor had an extremely solid foundation in the basic sword technique, and they had already reached an astonishingly profound level. With their abilities, even if they only used the basic sword technique, they could easily kill ordinary people of the same cultivation base. The sword technique seemed simple, but it was shockingly profound. They were excited to see the prey. Every sword attack was a close combat, and it was extremely dangerous. The Sword Emperor was very surprised. This person's basic sword technique was not inferior to his at all. During the exchange, their styles were completely different and exquisite. Chernzong also saw the different profoundness from the Sword Emperor's basic sword technique, and used it as a reference to learn. The Tao will of the heart sword originated from the heart. When the heart was moved, the mind would move, and when the mind moved, the sword would arrive. If the heart changed, the sword would change. As a result, the Tao intent of the Heart Sword was filled with boundless possibilities, causing Chen Zong's sword technique to be similarly filled with boundless possibilities. Through this, he was able to forge the Wuji chain sword that could continuously absorb the profundities of the myriad schools to reach perfection. The Sword Emperor's sword technique suddenly changed. Every sword attack was dyed with a layer of faint golden light, and the power of every sword attack skyrocketed. Every sword attack seemed simple and went straight for the heart, but its power was astonishing, and it was impossible to dodge. It was as if the Sword Emperor's orders had to be obeyed, and it attacked the mind. If it was anyone else, they would be affected, and their strength would be weakened. However, Chen Zong would not be affected, because Chen Zong's sword will was the Tao will of the Heart Sword. It originated from the heart, and it was the most effective and the most resistant to the Sword Emperor's sword will. The Sword Emperor had already used a close combat sword technique. It was the culmination of many sword techniques in his youth, the Imperial Heaven Sword of Earth. Chen Zong also used the Infinite Sword Chain. The battle of self-created sword techniques was also a battle of the Sword Tao between the two. They did not use Saint Power, nor did they use any other technique. The destructive power of the sword technique did not seem very strong, but in fact it was still very frightening, and its destructive power was shocking. Neither Chen Zong nor the Sword Emperor wanted to be hit, because it meant that they would be injured. And if they were injured, it would affect their ability to unleash their strength. This kind of close combat was the most dangerous. Every breath was like walking on the edge of life and death, and it also made Chen Zong and the Sword Emperor highly focused. The Sword Emperor's sword arrived, and the faint golden light became more intense. It was incomparably dazzling, and it illuminated the heavens and the earth. The shocking sword radiance was vast and majestic, and it was magnificent. The sword arrived directly, but it made Chen Zong feel that he could not avoid it no matter what. Even if he wanted to dodge, he could not avoid it. Even if he fled 1,000 miles away, he still could not avoid it. Since he could not avoid it, then he had to fight it. Chain. In the blink of an eye, countless sword radiances were shot out. They were densely packed, layer upon layer, and as they intersected, it was as if they were weaved into a swamp. It caused the Sword Emperor's mighty sword to be continuously weakened, and its power decreased continuously. The Sword Emperor was slightly surprised. The sword just now was one of his most powerful moves. It attacked directly and suppressed the opponent with force, but it was neutralized in such a way. And this neutralization method was really amazing. It weakened the sword radiances little by little. The second sword radiance was shot out. This time, the sword radiance was even more dazzling. The golden light illuminated the world, and it was extremely terrifying. Not only was it filled with shocking power, its speed was even more frightening. When the tyrannical power and speed were combined, a terrifying power was released with a simple technique, and it broke through the chain of sword radiances in one fell swoop. Wuji. The Wuji sword, which was getting more and more perfect, suddenly blocked the attack. Imperial Heaven and Earth. I am the Emperor of Heaven and Earth. The Sword Emperor shouted in a low voice, and the frightening power of a sovereign suddenly burst forth. The strongest sword slashed down from the sky, and the shadow of a giant seemed to appear on the Sword Emperor's body. It was shining with golden light, and it was as if the Emperor of Heaven and Earth was standing in the world. This sword radiated endless power and was extremely frightening. As it pressed down, Chen Zong could not help but tremble. It was as if he was about to kneel down in front of the Sword Emperor. However, Chen Zong's will was very strong. This frightening Imperial Heaven's power had a much smaller impact on Chen Zong than the others. He could completely resist it. Limitless. Chapter 1587. The Dominator of 6 Realms knows that everyone wants me to unleash my full potential. I also want to unleash my full potential. That means more money for the new year. But it's the end of the year, and there are more things to do. I don't have enough time. From Saint King Chongshan to the Demon Lord of Eternal Night, Chen Zong's infinite sword chain had been constantly improving. Whether it was the foundation of his swordsmanship that he had accumulated in the past or the 24 dragons and snakes painting that he had obtained in the Lingwu sacred ground, Chen Zong had been constantly comprehending and analyzing the mysteries in them, integrating them into the infinite sword chain. In the past, it was accumulation. Now, after repeated life-and-death battles with powerful and talented peerless geniuses, it was improvement. Accumulating strength, like a hot knife through butter. Now, the infinite sword chain's mysteries and power were much better than before. It seemed to be superior and even had a hint of transcendence. However, it was very subtle, and Chen Zong had not noticed it yet. But in the eyes of the Sword Emperor, this sword seemed to have endless possibilities. One sword, 10,000 swords. 10,000 swords, one sword. It was like dragons and snakes rising from the ground. This kind of subtlety surprised the Sword Emperor, and his eyes flickered. The Sword Emperor was the Sword Emperor after all. His swordsmanship were extremely brilliant. Although that sword could not kill Qinzong, the infinite sword chain was also useless. Both sides seemed to have a tacit understanding. After the two swords clashed, they quickly retreated and stared at each other. They were both surprised by each other's swordsmanship. Very strong. Very brilliant. However, Chen Zong was also very clear that if he had not challenged Saint King Chongshan but the Sword Emperor at the beginning, he would most likely not be a match for him. It was the battles at the beginning that stimulated the potential that he had accumulated over the years. Although his cultivation did not change, his swordsmanship became more and more perfect, and his strength increased as well. He had reached the point where he could fight the Sword Emperor head-on without losing. Martial arts, sword Tao, and sword will are the limit for many cultivators. The Sword Emperor did not attack again. Instead, he opened his mouth and said slowly. Chen Zong did not know what he meant, but he did not attack. Instead, he stared at the Sword Emperor and listened. Above sword will is domain. You can turn your will into a domain. The Sword Emperor said. Chen Zong suddenly understood. The Sword Emperor spoke of sword intent, but it also referred to Tao intent. After all, sword intent was a type of Tao intent. It was said that above the will of the way was the precept domain. That seemed to belong to the level of the strongest of the great saint realm. Compared to his current level, the difference was like heaven and earth. Between intent and domain, there is another realm known as the extreme realm. The Sword Emperor's words made Chen Zong's eyes light up. The pinnacle of Tao insight. That was still at the level of intent, but its power was above intent. Some top half-step Great Saint Realm experts had grasped the strength of the Tao Insight realm. I have a sword that has not reached the pinnacle, but is close to it. Please evaluate it. As soon as the Sword Emperor finished speaking, Chen Zong immediately understood the purpose of his words. A sword strike that was close to the pinnacle. Chen Zong was shocked, and then he felt an indescribable sense of anticipation and excitement. How strong would a sword strike that the Sword Emperor valued so much be? The Sword Emperor's expression was solemn, as if he was on a pilgrimage. Chen Zong's expression was solemn as well, and he was concentrating all his attention and waiting. This sword strike of mine is called Emperor's Shadow. The Sword Emperor's voice was even more solemn and respectful. As the Sword Emperor finished speaking, an indescribable aura seemed to envelop the Sword Emperor's body. It seemed like a force field, but it was not a force field. It distorted the air around him, as if his power had surpassed its original limit and reached a new height, and the surroundings could not bear it. Under the distortion, a shadow condensed on the Sword Emperor's body. The shadow seemed to be a figure, and it overlapped with the Sword Emperor's figure and merged into one. He swung his sword. Chen Zong did not know how to describe this sword strike. It seemed to be very slow, but it also seemed to be very fast, to the extreme. The feeling of fast and slow was contradictory, but it appeared in this sword strike at the same time. But that was secondary. The real tyrannical power was a kind of extreme power, as if a king had descended to the earth and suppressed everything. For a moment, Chen Zong felt that his body seemed to be suppressed and frozen, and he could not move. But Chen Zong also clearly realized that it was not that he could not move, but that he could not react in time. It was a very strange feeling, and it was hard to describe. In short, the power of this sword strike was extremely strong, and it was difficult for him to resist. It was a very terrifying sword strike. When the sword struck, the void under the sword directly turned into a vacuum. Burst. Chen Zong tried his best to burst out the heart sword Dao intent. This sword intent, if one's mind was strong, it would be stronger. If one's mind was weak, it would be weaker. Its strength was determined by one's mind. Facing the Sword Emperor's sword strike that was close to the pinnacle, if Chen Zong was defeated and his mind was weakened, he could only wait for death. But on the contrary, Chen Zong was not weakened. Instead, he burst out with a stronger mind and belief. Strong mind. Belief above all. Although this would not allow the heart sword Dao intent to break through the 9 cycles and reach the pinnacle, it would allow the potential of the heart sword Dao intent to burst out instantly, and its power would increase greatly. Limitless. This explosion happened in an instant. The limitless sword immediately attacked. One sword turned into 10,000 swords, and the 10,000 swords condensed into one sword, which became more and more powerful. It was as bright as a meteor streaking across the night sky, leaving behind an indestructible trajectory. The strongest sword strike collapsed under the Sword Emperor's shadow. The terrifying sword strike arrived brazenly, but the explosion of the limitless sword also bought Chen Zong a little bit of time. He retreated in an instant, and sword light flashed in succession. A series of sword strikes was the best way to weaken the power of the attack. However, this move still crumbled under the Emperor's shadow's sword strike. Retreat, retreat, retreat. Limitless. Chain. Limitless. His continuous attacks were all defeated by the Emperor's shadow. At the moment when the swords collided, an abundant and irresistible force rushed straight to him. The web between his thumb and forefinger cracked, and blood splattered. The tendons and bones in his arm seemed to be damaged by the terrifying force, and his body flew backward. Chen Zong couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. His face was pale. The Sword Emperor was too strong. After breaking through Limitless Infinity Sword's chain sword, he had even suffered heavy injuries. If the Sword Emperor attacked again, Chen Zong would be defeated. However, the Sword Emperor put his sword back into the sheath. You won. Chen Zong was slightly stunned, and then he understood. There were 2 reasons. First, it wasn't easy for the Sword Emperor to use the Emperor's shadow. It needed time. During the process, Chen Zong could have attacked and interrupted it, but he didn't. Second, the Emperor's shadow obviously overused the Sword Emperor's power. After all, this was the Sword Emperor's youth. Maybe there was a third reason, but Chen Zong didn't think too much about it. His mind was full of the Sword Emperor's shadow, which was close to the extreme state. A sword strike close to the extreme state of sword intent was really terrifying. The Emperor of Lingwu is very strong, the Sword Emperor said to Chen Zong as he returned to the throne. Chen Zong saluted with his sword and walked toward the door. As soon as he passed through the door, a mysterious power rushed into his body. In an instant, Chen Zong's injuries were healed, and the power he had consumed was also completely recovered. He stepped into the last palace of the Lingwu Imperial Palace, the Lingwu Palace in his peak state. How many years has it been? You are the second person besides the Sword Emperor to step into the Lingwu Palace. The figure on the throne wasn't very tall, but he had an indescribable, imposing manner. It was as if he was the center of the world, and everything had to follow him. Such might caused Chen Zong to be indescribably shocked, and it struck directly at his heart. The Emperor of Lingwu. This was the Emperor of Lingwu in his youth. Chen Zong didn't know if the Lingwu Emperor in his youth had already mastered the Lingwu Supreme Method. He shouldn't have. Draw your sword. Defeat me and you will ascend to the top. The Emperor of Lingwu's voice sounded again, with a certain rhythm that shook the surroundings. It was as if all the power in the surroundings would be controlled by him, and Chen Zong's expression became more and more serious. The Emperor of Lingwu's voice fell, but he sat on the throne without moving at all, as if waiting for Chen Zong to take the initiative to attack. In an instant, Chen Zong adjusted his essence, energy, and spirit, mobilized and condensed his power. He unsheathed his sword, and the sword light streaked across the sky, turning into an incomparably sharp sword energy that broke through the air. The sword light was like a crescent moon that cut through the sky, as if it was splitting the Lingwu palace into two. It mercilessly attacked the Emperor of Lingwu on the throne. The Emperor of Lingwu raised his eyelids slightly. He didn't make a move, but just pointed his finger. The spiraling finger shot out, breaking through the air. In an instant, it shattered the crescent moon-like sword light and shot towards Chen Zong like a hot knife through butter. This finger immediately made Chen Zong's pupils contract. It looked like a very ordinary finger energy, but it made his heart palpitate, as if it could penetrate everything. Under his gaze, the spiraling finger energy was like a drill, drilling through everything. The seventh step of the Thunder Step's 9 heavens. Immediately, Chen Zong blasted out with his sword, using the 9 heavens Sword King's 9 heavens Imperial Thunder Sword technique, the Thunder Blast. The power of the Thunder Blast was astonishing. The lightning was mighty and overbearing, and it blasted out in an instant. Its power was astonishing. In an instant, it merged with the power of the Thunder Step's 9 heavens, breaking through the original limit and becoming even more tyrannical. The Emperor of Lingwu's expression didn't change at all. He pointed his finger again, and the tyrannical finger energy broke through the air. The power of this finger was much more tyrannical than the first finger. The sword of the Thunder Blast was extremely violent, as if it wanted to destroy everything. Its power was astonishing. The power of the Emperor of Lingwu's finger didn't seem to be strong enough, but it was incomparably restrained. The finger pierced through the air, piercing through the lightning, and shot towards Chen Zong like a hot knife through butter. The 8th step of the Thunder Step's 9 heavens. The lightning immediately wrapped Chen Zong's body from top to bottom. It was incomparably blazing, and he avoided the Emperor of Lingwu's finger. The second move of the 9 heavens Imperial Thunder Sword technique, the Thunder Flash. The tyrannical power burst out, as if it had merged a little more, and the power was even more tyrannical. Kill. The sword of lightning shattered the sky, as if it had shattered the vacuum. Its power was much more tyrannical than the Thunder Blast. The Emperor of Lingwu's eyes revealed a hint of a smile, but his body still didn't move. He still lifted his finger and gently pointed. As if he was touching the water, ripples spread out from his fingertip, and immediately, a terrifying finger energy broke through the air. This finger energy was much more tyrannical than the previous two. The Thunder Blast was defeated again, and it directly attacked Chen Zong. Chen Zong waved his sword, and shattered the finger energy. Once again, he attacked with his sword. Wind Fire Sword Fury. This was the tyrannical sword that erupted from the fusion of the 8th Revolution Tao Will of Earth Fire and the 8th Revolution Tao Will of Hurricane. Its power was extremely tyrannical, and it covered everything in front of it, as if it wanted to shatter everything in front of it into powder. The Emperor of Lingwu's expression changed slightly. He was obviously shocked by the power of Chen Zong's sword. The power of the fused Tao Will was very strong. Chapter 1588. The Lingwu Emperor's figure was neither tall nor mighty, but when he stood up, it was as if a giant was supporting the sky. The entire Lingwu Imperial Palace was trembling, and a terrifying aura attacked the surrounding air, stirring up countless ripples that turned into huge waves. Under the gaze of Chen Zong's sharp eyes, he could only vaguely see the Lingwu Emperor reach out his right hand. His 5 fingers changed countless times in an instant, like a soaring eagle, like a giant whale coming out of the water. It was mysterious beyond compare. The wind and fire swords that seemed to be able to destroy everything paused for a moment. Then, the Lingwu Emperor's changing palms continuously slapped and bombarded, melting like ice and snow, unable to hurt him at all. Chen Zong's pupils shrank slightly. The Lingwu Emperor was really strong. His battle intent exploded, and his sword intent soared to the sky. The 8th step of the Thunder Steps of the 9 Heavens. In an instant, Chen Zong turned into a flash of lightning. His speed seemed to have increased, and his sword slashed across the sky, leaving behind a faint black trace. Kill! The Lingwu Emperor's lips curled into a smile. His shoulders seemed to sway imperceptibly, and his figure flickered slightly in an instant, becoming somewhat blurry. When Chen Zong's sword slashed past, it dissipated like a bubble. Chen Zong, on the other hand, seemed to have been hit by a huge force. He flew out uncontrollably, and his blood and qi shook incessantly. In an instant the sword slashed past. The Lingwu Emperor not only dodged, but also counterattacked. Fortunately, Chen Zong reacted in time and barely managed to block with his sword. Otherwise, he would have been seriously injured. The Lingwu Emperor was slightly surprised that his opponent had blocked his attack. However, this kind of battle was more interesting. His figure flickered again, and the Lingwu Emperor took the initiative to attack, closing in on Chen Zong. Fast. Fast. Extremely fast. The two of them fought in close quarters. Countless sparks flew, and countless waves of energy surged. It was as if a vacuum ripple had exploded layer upon layer. The entire Lingwu Imperial Palace was filled with sparks and ripples. 2 blurry figures were constantly crisscrossing and attacking in all directions. The terrifying power seemed to want to smash the Lingwu Imperial Palace into ruins. However, no one knew what material the Lingwu Imperial Palace was made of. It was incomparably sturdy. Under the terrifying impact of the 2 people, it was not damaged at all. Good, good, good. I didn't think that there would be such a genius among the latecomers. The young Lingwu Emperor laughed in an extremely carefree manner. He was at the top of his generation, suppressing an entire era. It was lonely at the top, and he had long since felt lonely. After countless years, only the Sword Emperor was able to defeat all the peerless geniuses of the various eras and fight fiercely with him. However, the Sword Emperor was still no match for him and was defeated in the end. Now, the Lingwu Emperor felt that the kid in front of him was much stronger than the Sword Emperor and was worth him going all out. Boom! His aura soared to the sky, as if it had shattered the dome of the Lingwu Imperial Palace. The terrifying aura suppressed all directions, and the heavens and the earth seemed to be under his control. At the same time, Chen Zong also activated his full strength, releasing an extremely shocking sword aura. An illusory sword appeared around him, emitting an extremely shocking sharpness that could cut through heaven and earth and tear everything apart. Time after time, Chen Zong's potential was stimulated. Unknowingly, he was improving continuously. Even if it was just a little bit of improvement, it had a significant impact. It was like a sword embryo that was constantly being forged and hammered into a treasured sword, and then sharpened into a real sword. The Lingwu Emperor did not use weapons. He himself was the best weapon. As soon as he started to attack, the Lingwu Emperor displayed an extremely shocking martial art. It could only be described with 4 words: extensive and profound. Every move was a move of a different martial art, and they all contained the essence and mystery of different martial arts. Hard, strong, soft, weak, fast, slow, explosive, flexible and changeable, seemingly endless. The Sword Emperor was defeated by this kind of attack, because there were too many changes, too fast, and it was difficult to keep up. Gradually, he fell into a disadvantage and was finally defeated. The title of Martial Emperor Ling was not an exaggeration. He was extremely talented and had a high level of comprehension. When he practiced martial arts, he was like a fish in water. In addition to his amazing background and cultivation, when he was young, he had already read a lot of ancient books. Moreover, he had practiced and comprehended the martial arts in those ancient books to a very high level. There were so many martial arts that it was as if there were stars in the sky. What was even more shocking was that the Lingwu Emperor did not use them inflexibly, but had truly grasped the essence of them. He used them as if they were floating clouds and flowing water, and changed them freely. This made it even harder for people to guard against and resist. If one could not keep up with his rhythm, they would quickly be suppressed by the opponent and fall into a disadvantage. In the end, they would be defeated or even killed. However, Chunzong's infinite sword chain was similar to the Lingwu Emperor's complex and changeable style of martial arts. Of course, the real difference was that the Lingwu Emperor's style of martial arts was complex and changeable, and there was a sense of disorganization. On the other hand, Chunzong's style of swordsmanship did not become the core, and contained a myriad of changes. With the infinite sword chain as the core, it absorbed the mystery and essence of various other martial arts, constantly improving and perfecting this swordsmanship, and raising its level, so that it contained more essence and changes. As soon as they exchanged blows, Chunzong was pleasantly surprised. The Lingwu Emperor was also pleasantly surprised. It was an unexpected feeling. One core was changeable, and the other core was unchangeable. Changeable and unchangeable seemed to be the opposite of each other, but they also had the same effect. Excited, the two temporarily put aside other things and displayed their core martial arts to their heart's content, and continued to exchange blows. The Lingwu Emperor's martial arts attainments exceeded Chunzong's expectations. Chunzong felt that his infinite sword chain would be even more refined. The Lingwu Emperor was also surprised by Chunzong's swordsmanship. He displayed his martial arts to his heart's content, and the intense battle continued. Time passed slowly. The time in the King Naming Pagoda was different from the time in the outside world. One day in the King Naming Pagoda was only a short period of time in the outside world. However, it was obvious that Chunzong's time in the King Naming Pagoda had surpassed that of the Taishan Saint. There were already some whispers, guessing where Chunzong had broken through. The Taishan Saint was expressionless. No one could tell what he was thinking. However, as he stared at the King Naming Pagoda, a sharp, cold light flashed in his eyes from time to time, as if it could tear the void apart. His heart was not calm at all. He would not allow anyone to surpass him. Even though he was only fourth on the 9-colored King Naming Pagoda and could not defeat the Eternal Night Demon Lord, the Sword Emperor, and the Lingwu Emperor to reach first place, he still wanted to become the top genius of this generation. He wanted to surpass his generation and surpass the previous generation. The Sky Frost Saint's son and the Ancient Saint's son were also surprised. Chunzong seemed to have been in the King Naming Pagoda for a longer time than the Taishan Saint's son. Although being in the King Naming Pagoda for a longer time did not necessarily mean that one had reached a higher level, it was normal for people to be evenly matched and fall into a bitter battle. It was difficult to determine the winner in a short time. However, they both had a feeling that perhaps Chunzong had surpassed them, or even the Taishan Saint's son. If that was true, they would only be happy because the Taishan Saint's son would no longer be the person standing at the top. Gong Tianxing's expression was very ugly. Could it be that after so many times, Chernzong had grown to the point where he could threaten his brother, God Gong? No. Gong Tianxing shook his head violently. Chernzong definitely could not surpass his brother, who was known as the reincarnation of a god. Regardless of what others thought, in the king-naming pagoda, in the Lingwu Palace, Chernzong and the young Lingwu Emperor's battle did not stop. It was extremely intense. For a time, relying on their respective martial arts, the two of them actually didn't fall into a disadvantageous position in close combat, and were evenly matched. Chernzong's swordsmanship was improving, and so was the young Lingwu Emperor. Potential. It was constantly being stimulated, breaking the limit, surpassing the limit, and increasing the upper limit. Fighting with you is indeed satisfying. Next, have a taste of my self-created Lingwu Sans Ho, the Lingwu Emperor said as he attacked. Immediately, his aura changed. It became more erratic, but also more condensed. This abnormal feeling made Chernzong feel very conflicted, and he immediately raised his guard to the extreme. In an instant, the Lingwu Emperor attacked. It was like a crane spreading its wings. It looked simple, but its trajectory was clear and mysterious. It gave Chernzong a feeling that it was in harmony with the heavens and earth, as if it had flown from the surface of the void. Everything could not resist its power. It would be pierced and torn apart. It was an extremely terrifying attack. The crane's beak was like a sharp sword, and the crane's wings were like blades. This attack contained some of the mysteries of the sword and the saber. Pierce. Tear. In an instant, Chernzong attacked with his sword. The sword light was endless, layer upon layer, like silk, smoke, and fog. Every sword seemed to weave, intertwining endlessly, and continuously weakening the power of the crane hand. The Lingwu Emperor's eyes lit up slightly. This move was really mysterious. It seemed to have no beginning and no end, and there were signs of it forming its own body. Moreover, the Lingwu Emperor could see that the potential of this move was still there. It had not been developed to the extreme. If it had been developed to the extreme, perhaps it would have formed its own body, an independent cycle, without beginning or end, and it would be difficult to break through. Even though it had not reached the extreme, its power was amazing. It also weakened the power of the crane hand. When it reached Chernzong, it only had less than 30% of its power left, and it was defeated by Chernzong with one sword. Wuji. The sword light was continuous, changing, and contained the mysteries of initiative. Every sword was as delicate and flexible as the work of nature. It was full of changes, as if it was covering all directions, and also as if it was attacking from the front. This sword made the Lingwu Emperor's eyes even brighter, and it shot out. The second move of the Lingwu Sans Ho, graceful hand. When the graceful hand was used, it was as if a huge black bird swept across the sky. Its speed was faster than the crane hand, and it was sharper than the crane hand. In essence, the graceful hand was the upgraded and strengthened version of the crane hand. Its power was even more tyrannical. The graceful hand was like a flying bird, constantly tearing and attacking. The sword light was shattered one by one, but at the same time, the graceful hand was also affected, and its power was constantly weakening. The sword light turned, and Chernzong used the infinite sword. Countless sword lights gathered into one in an instant. This sword light seemed to be majestic and mighty, and could shatter space. It also seemed to be condensed into a line, and could pierce through all things. It mercilessly attacked the Lingwu Emperor, and pierced through the graceful hand without mercy. Chapter 1589. The old man had been busy for most of his life, and was very proud of this new house. Now, the Six Paths has returned to the old house to help and make the old man happy. His eyes were as resplendent as the stars, their radiance illuminating the world. The young Lingwu Emperor's hands changed instantly. Flying crane hand and startling swan hand crossed his hands. It was very mysterious and brought about a shocking explosion. It was so sharp that it was as if a rock was soaring into the sky with its wings covering the sky. The third style of Lingwu Sanzhou, Rock Hand. Startling Swan Hand was an upgrade of Flying Crane Hand. Rock Hand was not only an upgrade of Startling Swan Hand, but also a qualitative change. The rock hits the water for 3,000 miles, shaking the 9 heavens. An incomparably shocking aura suddenly spread in all directions. Vaguely, there seemed to be an illusion of a rock condensing and appearing out of thin air. It let out an earth-shattering cry that shook the heavens and the earth. The might of this attack was unparalleled. In just an instant, the sword light of the limitless sword was blocked, shattered, and shattered. The illusion of the rock seemed to be endless. It filled the entire Lingwu Palace. The pressure on Chen Zong instantly increased to the extreme. Chen Zong only felt that he was suppressed by a terrifying aura. It was as if he was facing the oppression of heaven and earth. In an instant, it was as if he was facing the Emperor's shadow of the Sword Emperor. Was this attack also close to the level of the Supreme Realm? The infinite sword was shattered. It was as if everything would be shattered under this attack. Nothing could block it. A sense of uneasiness grew in his heart. Fortunately, Chen Zong's mind was very strong. He reacted instantly. He guarded his mind and did not waver. He gathered all his strength and exploded it. Myriad streams force field. Heart domain. All his techniques were used in an instant. They were superimposed on each other. Infinite. Once again, he attacked with his sword. The power of this sword increased by a lot. A sword light that seemed both majestic and slender, like a myriad of swords yet seemed like only one, tore through the sky and slashed out, drawing an incomparably profound trajectory. The trajectory was unpredictable and incomparable, yet it was extremely powerful, capable of piercing through and shattering everything. Collision. It was as if the collision and impact between the stars had burst forth with an incomparably terrifying power. The entire Lingwu Imperial Palace trembled incessantly, as if it was about to collapse. The incomparably shocking shockwave was like a torrential wave that surged and surged endlessly. The impact did not stop, and everything would be disintegrated and turned into powder. Under this terrifying force, it was as if the end of the world had arrived. Chen Zong and the Emperor of Lingwu's expressions were slightly solemn. They kept retreating and reducing the force. Take my Lingwu Sanzhou fourth form. Azure Fire Hand. The young Lingwu Emperor's voice became fleeting, his body became fleeting, and his hands became even more fleeting. In the blink of an eye, Chen Zong discovered that his surroundings seemed to have changed. From the martial spirit Emperor Palace, he had appeared on a barren land. Looking up, the sky was filled with grayish-white clouds that moved with the wind, as if they were endless waves. Immediately, the wind stopped and the clouds stopped. It was as if the space had frozen. Then, a circle of ripples suddenly shook out from the void. It was as if a huge rock had been thrown into a calm lake. Layers of ripples spread out and turned into waves that surged in all directions. An extremely strong sense of danger suddenly rushed over and engulfed his entire body. It made Chen Zong extremely shocked. From the countless ripples, an almost black flowing flame fell. Its speed was getting faster and faster. It was like a black comet falling down. It carried an incomparably terrifying power, as if it could destroy the heavens and the earth. This attack was the Azure Fire Hand. It was also an attack that was extremely close to the ultimate state. It was even more terrifying than the Sword Emperor's shadow. Similarly, there were differences in strength between those who were close to the ultimate state. Some were just close, while others were very close. There were even some who were only a little bit away. An incomparably sharp and violent roar resounded through the heavens and the earth. It directly pierced through the eardrums, causing Chen Zong's mind to tremble. This move had surpassed the previous 3 moves. It was a complete qualitative change, and was even more difficult to deal with. Chen Zong could not help but feel that he could not resist this attack. Even if he attacked with all his might, he still could not block this attack. He would be killed by this attack. This feeling became more and more intense. It occupied his mind like a demon. There seemed to be the sound of a long sword. In an instant, the thought that was unfavorable to him was cut off. His essence, energy, and spirit condensed, sublimated, and exploded in an instant. In his mind, countless thoughts flowed through in an instant. Countless essences also surged and gushed out. This was between life and death. Between life and death, there were great terrors and great opportunities. The painting of the 24 dragons and snakes. The accumulation of the past swordsmanship. The infinite sword chain. All of the essences burst out in an instant. Countless inspirations appeared, surging endlessly like waves. The extreme-edge sword was trembling slightly, and a trace of astonishing sharpness was spreading out. Gradually, more and more sword lights appeared in his mind. Each sword light represented a thought, a kind of mystery. The mysteries were colliding, gathering, and bursting out new sword lights, filling up his entire mind and mind. It was endless. In the blink of an eye, the sword light that gushed out of Chen Zong's mind had only appeared for an extremely short period of time. The sword light grew from a small amount to a large amount, and then rapidly decreased from a large amount to a small amount. In the end, there was only one ray left, or rather, it gathered into one ray. That sword light vaguely contained the mystery of the infinite sword chain. It was as if 10,000 swords had merged into one sword. The sword light looked incomparably majestic and slender, but it was constantly condensing and becoming more and more condensed. From the thickness of an arm, it kept condensing to the thickness of a thumb, and finally to the thickness of a chopstick. It seemed to have reached the limit. Chen Zong slashed out with his sword as if he was enlightened, piercing through the sky. There was no smoke, no murderous intent. It was just a very plain sword, a very ordinary sword. But when the sword slashed out, a beam of sword light as thick as a chopstick pierced through the sky. It caused the young Lingwu Emperor's pupils to shrink to the size of needles. He was inexplicably shocked. This sword was increasingly terrifying. A sword that was enlightened. A sword that gathered all of his accumulations and precipitated. A sword that flashed with spiritual light. A sword that burst out under the threat of the young Lingwu Emperor's azure fire hand. This was a sword that was close to the extreme realm. When the sword slashed out, there was a kind of cathartic pleasure, like a torrent bursting through a dam. It was incomparably carefree, and the power of the whole body surged and erupted in an instant. For a moment, Chen Zong could not clearly describe this feeling with word. He only felt that it was very carefree, as if his whole body was about to fly into the sky. His essence, qi, and spirit seemed to be constantly slashing upwards with the sword light. Sublimation. Close to the extreme realm. Chasing the extreme realm. This was a very wonderful feeling. The terrifying black comet-like flowing light fell, and came into contact with the sword light that Chen Zong had slashed out. In an instant, the world seemed to stagnate, and then burst apart in an instant. The colors turned black and white, and there was no sound. It was like a world of dead silence. But in the next moment, an extremely terrifying sharp sound surged out, filling the world. In an instant, Chen Zong seemed to have returned to the Lingwu Imperial Palace, and was facing the young Lingwu Emperor. In the battle of the Great Era, geniuses come forth in large numbers. After so many years, I am very happy to have met you. The young Lingwu Emperor did not attack again. Instead, he slowly walked forward with his hands behind his back, and returned to the Emperor's throne. He said, "In this battle, although our cultivation is equal, the cultivation technique that you practice is too ordinary." The Lingwu Emperor did not attack again, and Chen Zong also stood still. The young Lingwu Emperor finally said, "This battle is considered your victory. I hope that you will not die prematurely. One day, your name will be heard in the void of the universe. Chernzong was slightly startled. I won? But since the young Lingwu Emperor said so, Chernzong did not argue. However, what the Lingwu Emperor said was not wrong. His Dexian origin art was indeed a bit ordinary, and it was among the top-grade sage-level cultivation technique. Cultivation techniques were also a relatively important part of one's strength, and it was indispensable. When a powerful cultivation technique was cultivated to a profound level, it would increase one's strength significantly. Suddenly, Chernzong felt a force fall on his body, and he could not resist it at all. Soon after, everything around him rippled like water, and the young Lingwu Emperor in front of him seemed to become blurry, as if he was an illusion. In the next moment, a 9-colored light circulated, and Chernzong seemed to be ascending. This feeling was incomparably wonderful. This was a brand new palace, and there was a huge throne. After the flowing light, everything returned to normal. The Emperor's throne. The Emperor's throne was summoning. Chernzong focused his eyes and walked forward. He walked up the 15th flight of stairs and stood in front of the Emperor's throne, then turned around and sat down. In an instant, it was as if the heavens and earth were roaring, and an unparalleled power swept over. Chernzong seemed to have merged with the Emperor's throne, becoming the center of a world. Threads of extremely sharp aura were guided out of Chernzong's body and merged with the Emperor's throne. With the Emperor's throne as the center, it rapidly spread throughout the entire palace. The dome, the walls, the pillars, the floor, everything was covered by a layer of extremely sharp aura. It seemed to be sword energy that originated from Chernzong's sword energy. Chernzong also felt as if a part of himself was merging with the Emperor's throne, creating a brand new transformation. Then, Chernzong stood up, but there was still another Chernzong sitting on the Emperor's throne. Suddenly, Chernzong understood. This was the power of the king-naming pagoda. It left its own imprint and formed a brand new body, giving it its own consciousness and all of its own cultivation and strength. It was just like itself, but it had nothing to do with itself. It wasn't a clone, but it was similar to a clone. Even if the original body died, the clone inside the king-naming pagoda wouldn't be affected. Naturally, the purpose of this body being left here was for those who came later to challenge it. Chernzong also knew that this was the 15th palace of the king-naming pagoda. The plaque outside the palace was originally blank, but now 3 large black words appeared, emitting an incomparably sharp aura. They were like divine swords. Jiandi Palace. Jiandi. Chernzong was also very surprised. He actually obtained the title of Jiandi. Jiandi. The Emperor of Swords was even more shocking than the Emperor of Swords. Then, the words Lingwu Palace disappeared, and 3 large words appeared. Jiandi Palace. Now, Chernzong defeated the Lingwu Emperor and became the number 1. This palace was naturally named after Chernzong's title. Jiandi Palace replaced the Lingwu Palace. This represented the change of era and the arrival of a new era. Chapter 1590. In the King-Naming Tower of the King-Naming World. Light flowed around the King-Naming Tower. There were 9 different colors, and they were dazzling and beautiful. Everyone's attention was drawn to the King-Naming Tower. Chernzong had finally finished. Many people knew about him. After all, Chernzong's reputation had spread far and wide after the competition for a spot in the Lingwu Sacred Land. Now, he had spent a much longer time in the King-Naming Tower than the Taishan Saint. Everyone was looking forward to it. He should be able to detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower. Everyone's attention was on him. The 9-colored light bloomed from the bottom of the King-Naming Tower. Then, it shot up into the sky 1 level at a time. When it reached the top, it turned into the first beam of crimson light and shot into the sky. Boom! In an instant, the crimson light exploded in the sky and turned into countless beams. At the highest point, they turned into countless shooting stars. The beams of crimson light were extremely dazzling. They seemed to be burning with crimson flames as they streaked across the sky. They formed the most beautiful trajectory. It was so beautiful that people were mesmerized. When the crimson light exploded and streaked in all directions, from the top of the king-naming pagoda, another streak of orange light shot into the sky and exploded at the highest point. Countless orange meteors streaked across the sky in the most beautiful trajectory. The third beam was yellow. The fourth beam was green. The fifth beam was green. The sixth beam was blue. The seventh beam was purple. The eighth beam was silver. The ninth beam was the most dazzling. It was gold. 9-colored light. The 9-colored heavenly flower had exploded. It was extremely dazzling. Extremely dazzling. Extremely shocking. At the same time, a 9-colored heavenly flower appeared in the sky above the Tianyuan sacred territory. It exploded and its 9-colored light shot out in all directions. It covered the sky and shocked everyone. Who is it? Other than the Taishan saint, who else can detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower? There are 2 people who can detonate the 9-colored heavenly flower. Could this be another golden age? It's comparable to Emperor Lingwu's golden age. Shocking. Everyone was extremely shocked. From ancient times until now, only in the era of the spiritual martial emperor had 2 peerless monsters who had detonated the 9-colored heavenly flower. And now, after countless years, they had appeared once again. Furthermore, what was different from Emperor Lingwu's era was that there was not much time between the detonation of the 9-colored heavenly flower. It had only been a few hours. In other words, the 2 people who had detonated the 9-colored heavenly flower should still be in the king realm at this moment. This was even more shocking than the era of Emperor Lingwu. Moreover, many people noticed that the area covered by the explosion of the 9-colored heavenly flowers this time seemed to be even larger than before. Could it be that the person who detonated the 9-colored heavenly flower wasn't the Taishan saint's son, but someone else? And this time, it was the Taishan saint's son who detonated it? Those who thought this way were those who had great confidence in the Taishan saint's son, but they also represented the views of the majority. Could it be him? Xian Konglua looked up at the sky and at the extremely dazzling 9-colored heavenly flower. He secretly guessed, but he didn't dare to be sure. After all, this was too shocking. Since ancient times, every person who detonated the 9-colored heavenly flower would definitely become a supreme saint, and they would be the best of the best. In the king realm, everyone was dumbfounded. The Taishan saint's son subconsciously clenched his fists so tightly that his fingers were almost twisted. The veins on the back of his hands bulged, showing the violent fluctuations and anger in his heart. This was because the scale of the 9-colored heavenly flower was even larger than his. The ranking on the king realm tablet was actually closely related to the scale of the 9-colored heavenly flower. The larger the scale, the higher the ranking. Now, the scale of the 9-colored heavenly flower detonated by that person was much larger than his, which meant that the other person's ranking was above his. This was unacceptable. Unforgivable. Gong Tianxing was completely stunned. This person had clearly surpassed his brother, God Gong. How could there be such a terrifying person? Could it be that he was the true reincarnation of a god? The ancient saint's son and Sky Chill saint's son were also very shocked, but after the shock, they were pleasantly surprised. This way, in this era, the Taishan saint's son wasn't the only one who could reign supreme. Someone was above the Taishan saint's son. Although it wasn't them, it still felt good. The 9-colored heavenly flower completely detonated. Its flowing light immediately covered the sky of the king realm, falling from the edge of the sky. It was incomparably dazzling, reflecting everyone's faces. They were extremely shocked, from the bottom of their hearts. The Taishan saint's son stared at the 9-colored heavenly flower in the sky, his eyes filled with murderous intent. At the same time, Chernzong's figure appeared in the king realm tower, which also attracted everyone's attention. Everyone was either shocked or excited. Only the Taishan Saint's son's eyes were filled with murderous intent. They were as cold and sharp as swords, as if they were going to pierce through Chen Zong. But Chen Zong fearlessly looked back at the Taishan Saint's son. Indeed, in the King Realm Tower, he had fought with the Taishan Saint's son and defeated him. Although that wasn't the real Taishan Saint's son, and the real Taishan Saint's son would only be stronger, Chen Zong had never been afraid. Even now, there was an obvious gap in cultivation. If they really fought, it was still unknown who would win and who would lose. After all, he had greatly improved in the King Realm Tower. Moreover, after detonating the 9-colored heavenly flower, he had received the recognition of the King Realm Tower and the will of heaven and earth. Invisibly, his understanding of the mysteries of heaven and earth had at least doubled. Originally, Chen Zong's comprehension ability was very shocking. When he comprehended the mysteries of heaven and earth, he was far better than other geniuses. Now, his understanding of the mysteries of heaven and earth had doubled. It was as if his comprehension ability had been improved in a disguised way. Of course, this was different from a direct increase in comprehension ability. If one's comprehension ability increased, the effect of comprehension would be comprehensive. No matter what one comprehended, it would be faster. But now, the improvement was targeted at the mysteries of heaven and earth. However, the mysteries of heaven and earth were very important. It was the main path of cultivation. Therefore, it was very useful. Although the effect would not be obvious in a short time, after a long time, the benefits would be very shocking. Chen Zong had absolute confidence that he would surpass the Taishan Saint. First, suddenly there was an exclamation. Many people stared. The Taishan Saint could not help but look away from Chen Zong's face and onto the 9-colored King Realm Monument. First place, Jiandi Chen Zong. Jiandi. Everyone was shocked. He had the title of Emperor. Since ancient times, only the Emperor of Lingwu had been given the title of Emperor. This showed how difficult it was and how shocking it was. Now there was one more. Jiandi. Being called an emperor with the sword meant that he had amazing talent and attainments in the way of the sword. This was not a title that others casually gave, nor was it a title that he boasted about himself. It was a title that was recognized by the King Realm Tower and the will of heaven and earth. Peerless talent. The first person since ancient times. In an instant, everyone was shocked. They were extremely shocked. The Taishan Saint's eyes became sharper. They were filled with terrifying murderous intent. The murderous intent was shocking and filled the air. Everyone was terrified. The murderous intent seemed to want to kill Chen Zong directly. However, it could not harm Chen Zong at all. This was the King Realm Tower. The Taishan Saint did not dare to do anything. If he did, he would definitely be suppressed and punished by the King Realm Tower. The consequences would be severe. No one dared to offend him. Wait here. The Taishan Saint said to Chen Zong. Then, his body faded rapidly and disappeared from everyone's sight. He had left. Since he had already passed the King Realm Tower and obtained a shocking title, there was no need for Chen Zong to continue staying here. In the next instant, Chen Zong's body faded rapidly and disappeared from everyone's sight. After Chen Zong left, everyone seemed to explode. There were all kinds of discussions. Shocking. Shocking. After this day, the news would spread. At that time, the 9 realms would be shaken. After all, detonating the 7-colored heavenly flower was shocking enough. Detonating the 8-colored heavenly flower was even more shocking. As for detonating the 9-colored heavenly flower, it was unparalleled. Since ancient times, it was extremely rare. Moreover, this time, 2 people had detonated the 9-colored heavenly flower consecutively. More importantly, the scale of one of the 9-colored heavenly flowers was shocking. Chen Zong had obtained an emperor-level title and directly reached the top. He had surpassed the Emperor of Lingwu and become the first monstrous talent since ancient times. Thus, the world would be shocked. Outside the King Realm, in the Xianyuan world of Tianyuan Sacred Region, where Chenzong had left, a 9-colored light rippled like water. It flickered continuously. Then, a figure condensed. It was Chenzong. Chenzong stood in the Xianyuan world with his eyes closed. He felt that the mystery of the world had become extremely clear. It was as if it was lingering in all directions and was within reach. This feeling was unprecedented. It was extremely wonderful. This was the mystery of heaven and earth. The mystery of the world was actually different in strength. If some places were stronger, it would be easier to feel and comprehend. However, if some places were weaker, it would be harder to feel and comprehend. At this moment, Chenzong's perception of the mystery of the world had more than doubled. This meant that in the future, Chenzong's comprehension of the mystery of the world would be twice as fast and twice as easy. He opened his eyes. In the depths of his eyes, there seemed to be a 9-colored divine light flowing. It contained endless mystery. Let's go back first before going into seclusion, Chenzong thought to himself. It was not suitable for him to go into seclusion after returning. He extended his body and immediately turned into a bolt of lightning. In an instant, he tore through the sky. He flew past at an astonishing speed and disappeared into the distance. Although his cultivation did not increase, his speed was several times faster than when he came. It was even more shocking. His journey was unimpeded, and he did not encounter any abnormal situations. As Chenzong flew towards his destination, he diverted some of his attention to comprehend the mystery of the world. Although this kind of comprehension couldn't be compared to closed-door cultivation, the effects weren't bad either. This was especially so after passing the King's Ceiling Pagoda. At every moment, Chenzong could sense that he was improving bit by bit. Maybe this wasn't much, but accumulating water would make a lot of water. When he accumulated enough, it would cause a qualitative change. He would break through his original shackles and rise to a higher level, becoming even more shocking. Chapter 1591. The sky was boundless and blue, like a huge gem, clear and bright, pleasing to the eye. The sky was vast, and the mind was lofty. A bolt of lightning flashed by at an astonishing speed. It was Chenzong, who was rushing towards the Xianyuan kingdom. Suddenly, the bolt of lightning slightly adjusted its trajectory, and fell down like a meteor. It was so fast and powerful that it seemed like it was going to collapse the ground. At the moment the ball of lightning was about to hit the ground, it paused for a moment, and the lightning quickly dissipated. His body became as light as a feather and floated down. His feet touched the ground, and he did not even move a speck of dust. His long robe fluttered, as if it was rippling in the water, and then it gradually returned to silence. Chenzong stood still with his eyes closed, meditating and comprehending. Suddenly, his eyelids trembled slightly, and he opened his eyes. His eyes emitted an extremely cold light, as if two extremely sharp sword lights were tearing through the sky. They tore the air in front of him as if they were solid, and they drew across the ground, leaving two straight sword marks. The extreme sword was also unsheathed in an instant, and it turned into an extremely sharp sword light that tore through the void and attacked forward. The sword light was decisive, sharp, and indestructible. It was as if there was nothing in the world that could block the sharpness of this sword. But when the sword light was about to hit the boulder, it suddenly became soft, as if refined steel had turned soft, and in an instant it surrounded the boulder. The sword light disappeared, and the boulder remained motionless. After a few breaths, a small mark appeared around the boulder, and it was cut in a circle from all directions, and went straight into the boulder. The combination of hardness and softness. Chenzong did not use any power in this strike, and it was only one of the mysteries of the 24 dragons and snakes painting. Unknowingly, his swordsmanship had improved again. Sheathing the extreme sword, Chen Zong was about to continue flying, but he paused for a moment. His eyes stared ahead, and they were so sharp that even the air seemed to have become sharp. A figure was flying in front of him, and it was not fast but rather leisurely. Staring at the figure in front of him, Chen Zong's eyes seemed to ripple, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. That smile seemed to contain traces of killing intent. Ming Daozi. This person was none other than Ming Daozi, who had brought him and the other prodigies from the 4 upper regions to the Tianyuan sacred region. Back then, Ming Daozi had used his identity as an expert of Tianyuan sacred region to give the geniuses a chance to enter Tianyuan sacred region. He said that they would become disciples of his sect and receive training. But that was not the case. As soon as the geniuses entered the Tianyuan sacred region, they were betrayed by Ming Daozi and sold to the dark forces. If not for his decisiveness and good luck, he would still be in the dark forces and become their executioners. He might have even been killed. Perhaps Ming Daozi had brought him into the Tianyuan sacred region, and it was because he had entered the Tianyuan sacred region that he had obtained various opportunities and constantly improved his cultivation by leaps and bounds. This was a level that he could not achieve in the 4 upper regions. However, Chen Zong would not be grateful to him, not even a little bit, because Ming Daozi had been up to no good from the beginning. Of course, Chen Zong did not deliberately look for Ming Daozi, but since they had met, it was time to settle their grudge. Ming Daozi sensed Chen Zong's gaze and immediately looked over. When he saw a young face, he was slightly taken aback. Then, he felt that this person seemed familiar, as if he had seen him somewhere before. Cultivators usually had good memories, but Ming Daozi had experienced many things over the past dozen years. In addition, he had brought the geniuses from the 4 upper regions into the Tianyuan sacred region and sold them to the dark forces. It was not a big deal to him, so he did not take those geniuses seriously. To be honest, in Ming Daozi's opinion, the geniuses from the 4 upper regions were nothing after entering the Tianyuan sacred region, and it would be difficult for them to achieve anything. Moreover, they had entered the dark forces, and it was unknown whether they could survive. In addition, as more than a dozen years had passed, Chen Zong's temperament had changed a lot from before, so Ming Daozi did not recognize him. However, Ming Daozi instinctively felt that the person in front of him was not simple, and seemed to be a threat to him. Moreover, he was so young, so he must be a peerless genius with a shocking background. Ming Daozi could not be an enemy of such a young genius, and it would be best if he could befriend him. "My name is Ming Daozi. How should I address you?" Ming Daozi approached Chen Zong, cupped his hands, and asked with a smile, trying to show his goodwill. "My name is Chen Zong," Chen Zong said calmly, and the sharpness in his eyes seemed to be restrained. Chen Zong. Ming Daozi was slightly taken aback. This name seemed to be very shocking over the years, but he did not know if this person was Chen Zong. After all, the world was so big that it was not strange to have people with the same name. Some people would even deliberately change their names. "It seems that you don't recognize me." Chen Zong smiled faintly, but when Ming Daozi saw that smile, he suddenly felt his heart skip a beat. There was no reason for it. "Do I know you?" Ming Daozi's heart skipped a beat and he quickly asked. Although Ming Daozi's cultivation base was at the intermediate 9th level Saint Rudiment stage, and he was not weak in the Tianyuan sacred region, he was actually not ranked. After all, he was only at the intermediate 9th level Saint Rudiment stage, and there were many people in the Tianyuan sacred region who were stronger than him. Moreover, there was a kind of peerless genius who could fight and kill enemies above their level. If this person in front of him was really Chen Zong, then he was a top peerless genius who could not be made an enemy of. If there was any misunderstanding, it was best to resolve it, even if it meant paying a price. It seems that you really have forgotten, Chernzong said leisurely. More than a decade ago, in the 4 upper regions, you tricked them into the Tianyuan sacred region and sold them to the dark forces. Ming Daozi's expression changed when he heard Chernzong's words, and scenes flashed through his mind. It had only been more than a decade, and it was actually a very short time. Now that he took the initiative to recall, the scenes from back then flashed through his mind. The face in front of him suddenly overlapped with the face from more than a decade ago. After all, Chernzong's performance back then was quite outstanding, and he was the most valuable genius among the 4 upper regions, so he had left a deep impression on Ming Daozi. Let's end the grudge from back then. Chernzong didn't say anything. As soon as he finished speaking, he unsheathed his extreme-edge sword, and an incomparably sharp sword light instantly tore through the air. It was a lifeless strike, and it mercilessly attacked Ming Daozi. So it's you. You actually managed to escape, but you'll die if you meet me, Ming Daozi shouted. The smile on his face had disappeared and was replaced by a ferocious and murderous look. Boom! The tyrannical aura of a middle 9th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage cultivator burst out without reservation and soared into the sky. Ming Daozi's figure flew forward at an extremely fast speed, like a flash of cold light. His fingers clenched together as he swept them forward from the side of his body, as if he wanted to pierce through everything with his sharp and unparalleled precision. This attack seemed to be indestructible, and it demonstrated Ming Daozi's amazing strength. However, this attack was nothing in Chernzong's eyes. It was nothing compared to the peerless geniuses he had faced before. Under normal circumstances, a 9th Heaven Saint Realm cultivator's strength was indeed several times stronger than a 7th Heaven Saint Realm cultivator. However, Chernzong wasn't an ordinary 7th Heaven Saint Realm cultivator. He was a peerless monster who stood at the pinnacle of his generation. His strength couldn't be measured by common sense. Moreover, Chernzong's past opponents were all peerless geniuses. Not only were they powerful, but they were also very skilled in martial arts. When they performed ordinary moves, they could turn something rotten into something magical. Ming Daozi was only an ordinary 9th level Saint Rudiment stage cultivator. Although his martial arts were good, he could not be compared to those peerless geniuses. Regardless, Ming Daozi was a 9th level Saint Rudiment stage powerhouse, and his strength was not weak. With the huge gap between their cultivation bases, it would not be easy for Chernzong to kill him. Fight! Ming Daozi's heart was filled with killing intent. He wanted to kill Chernzong now. Otherwise, there would be endless trouble in the future. Similarly, Chernzong wanted to end their feud, so he naturally wanted to kill Ming Daozi. Infinite Sword Chain Slash. As soon as this sword technique was displayed, it instantly closed in on Ming Daozi, causing him to be flustered. In terms of cultivation method, Ming Daozi was not as good as Chernzong. In terms of martial arts attainments, Ming Daozi was not as good as Chernzong. In terms of comprehension of Dao intent, Ming Daozi was not as good as Chernzong. The only thing he could surpass Chernzong in was his cultivation base. However, in the face of all these differences, cultivation base was not that important. Myriad streams force field. In an instant, hundreds of torrents rushed toward Ming Daozi. Chernzong did not intend to fight for a long time. Although Ming Daozi's martial arts were not bad, the gap between him and his previous opponents was too obvious. It would not have any effect on him at all. Therefore, he wanted to kill him as soon as possible. Under the impact of the hundreds of torrents, Ming Daozi's limbs and bones were immediately bound, making it difficult for him to move. In his horror, he immediately unleashed all his strength to break free from the torrent. However, when he broke free from the restraints of the 100 torrents, a sword light that was faster than lightning pierced through the sky like a stream of light and attacked him. Dodge. However, he was powerless to do anything. He only felt that his body had become incomparably heavy in an instant, and he was unable to move at all. He could only watch helplessly as the beam of light pierced through the space between his eyebrows and flew out from the back of his head. Ming Daozi stared at Chenzong. His eyes gradually dimmed, and they were filled with unwillingness and regret. If he had known that this day would come, he would have killed this boy back then. Otherwise, he would not have left behind such a trouble that would lead to his death. Unfortunately, it was all too late. There was no medicine for regret. A drop of bright red blood fell from the extreme-edge sword. The blade was not stained by even a speck of dust. It slowly entered the scabbard, and the sound of the blade rubbing against the scabbard was very pleasing to the ear. Chenzong stared at Ming Daozi with an indifferent expression. Back then, Ming Daozi was a powerhouse that he could only look up to and made him feel like an ant in front of him. Now, he had lost his life under his sword. Moreover, it was not difficult for him to do so. In this battle, he had not unleashed all of his strength. This was the difference between an ordinary rogue cultivator and a peerless monster. Chapter 1592. To Chenzong, killing Ming Daozi was just settling a grudge. It wasn't a big deal, but Chenzong also felt that his essence, qi, and spirit seemed to have sublimated slightly. Chenzong quickly returned to the Xianyuan kingdom and went straight to the Xiantian army's camp to cultivate in seclusion. This was the territory of the Xiantian army, and there was the protection of the Supreme Saint Xiantian Divine General. Even a veteran Supreme Saint like Xianyuan Shangren would not dare to be presumptuous. If two Supreme Saint experts were to fight, the Xianyuan kingdom would probably fall apart. The price was too great and no one could bear it. Moreover, Chenzong's title of Jiandi was a foregone conclusion. Chenzong began to cultivate in seclusion, but the outside world was turned upside down because of Chenzong's title. It turned out that the most monstrous talent of this era was not the Taishan Holy Sun, but Chenzong, a person who had come from a humble background. No one had expected that he could reach this level. "It's really him," Xian Kongluo exclaimed. Chu Wangshi's expression was gloomy. He found it hard to accept. Chu Wangshi entered the king-naming pagoda a few years earlier than Chenzong, but in the end, it was only the seven-colored heavenly flower that exploded. Compared to most cultivators, it was incomparably amazing, but compared to the real monstrous talents, there was still a huge gap. Even if Chu Wangshi's ranking on the seven-colored king-naming tablet was high, he could not compare to the eight-colored heavenly flower, let alone the nine-colored heavenly flower. Chenzong was first on the seven-colored king-naming tablet and was titled as Jiandi. Crushing. It was a complete suppression, but Chu Wangshi was still extremely unwilling to accept this. Why? He was the most outstanding talent of the Xianyuan royal family. He was of noble birth and was the personal disciple of the supreme saint expert Xianyuan Shangren. He had been trained since young, and his talent and strength were not comparable to others. And Chenzong was just a lowly person from a remote place. How could he reach the top? He was unwilling. So what? This was the truth. It was already a foregone conclusion that could not be changed. The entire Tianyuan sacred region was shocked by Chenzong. Countless people were talking about it, but the person involved was in closed-door cultivation. No one could see him. The Xiantian army, especially the Shunxian army, was shocked at first, then overjoyed. This was because Chenzong was a member of the Shunxian army. This greatly increased the prestige of the Shunxian army. Jiandi. He was the first person in history, the first person in the way of the sword. Perhaps there were many people who were better and more powerful than Jiandi Chenzong in the way of the sword, but those people had been immersed in the way of the sword for much longer than Chenzong. He believed that with Chen Zong's talent, it would not be difficult for him to catch up and surpass those people. As Chen Zong's teammates, Tianji and the others were happy for Chen Zong. As for Chu Zhongyang, he felt incomparably bitter. Since then, he had truly let go of the unreconciled competition between him and Chen Zong. This was merely a one-sided competition. Chen Zong had probably long since stopped seeing him as an opponent. It was laughable that he still could not let go. But it was fine now. The heavenly flower that exploded when he entered the kingship pagoda was only a 7-colored one. Moreover, his name on the 7-colored kingship tablet was only in the middle. There was a huge gap between him and an 8-colored one, let alone a 9-colored one. There was no need to say much about reaching the top. As for Su Mubai, although he had already stopped competing with Chen Zong in secret, he could not help but be dazed and shocked. Closed-door cultivation. Cultivation was not just cultivation techniques or swordsmanship. It was an all-round cultivation. After cultivating a cultivation technique, he would cultivate a swordsmanship. After cultivating a swordsmanship, he would comprehend the way. He was cultivating every moment. Improvement. Chen Zong could feel that his overall strength was slowly improving. The great mystery art broke through again and reached the 29th level. He was only one level away from the great mystery art's great perfection realm. He remembered that the great mystery art's way intent would be even stronger. After obtaining the recognition of the will of heaven and earth, Chen Zong's speed of comprehending the mysteries of heaven and earth increased greatly. The peak Tao intent, Heart Sword Tao intent, had already reached the 9th revolution. Above that was the so-called extreme realm. However, it was not easy to reach the extreme realm from the 9th revolution. It might be a long process. Even though Chen Zong had obtained the recognition of the will of heaven and earth, his comprehension speed had increased greatly. On the other hand, the comprehension speed of the intermediate Tao intent of wind, fire, and lightning was gratifying. They had broken through from the 8th revolution to the 9th revolution, and their power had increased accordingly. However, after the Tao intent reached the 9th revolution, it was the extreme realm. It was very difficult. Even though the intermediate Tao intent was easier to comprehend than the peak Tao intent, Chen Zong could not reach it in a short period of time. As for the sword art, Chen Zong had further comprehended the mysteries of the 24 dragons and snakes portrait. The more he comprehended this technique, the more he felt that its mysteries were astonishing. It was not inferior to the Heart Sword Saint's Heart Sword Sutra at all. Currently, he had already comprehended the mysteries of the Heart Sword Sutra. Under the control of Chen Zong's tyrannical divine sense, the majestic and pure great mystery saint force constantly condensed and compressed, finally condensing into a sword. Sword of Yuan Qi. A sword condensed from the pure and majestic Yuan Qi in his body. This sword could cut through heaven and earth. The sword's momentum was unparalleled and shocking to the extreme. Wherever it passed, there was nothing it could not destroy. The shackles were shattered and penetrated in an instant. Immediately after, the sword of Yuan Qi dispersed again, transforming into incomparably pure Yuan Qi. It quickly circulated along the path of the great mystery art and spread throughout his body. An incomparably carefree feeling arose spontaneously. It was very comfortable, and his entire body seemed to be on the verge of ascending. The 30th level. The great mystery art had reached the great perfection realm. The great mystic origin formula that had reached perfection allowed him to refine the Yuan Qi of heaven and earth much faster. A large amount of Yuan Qi that poured into his body from the sky was quickly refined into great mystic origin saint energy, causing Chen Zong's cultivation to soar by leaps and bounds. His saint energy also became increasingly pure. A large amount of energy from the heavenly origin pills and the outside world's origin energy were continuously absorbed and refined. Chunzong's aura also continued to rise. Intermediate 7th Heaven Saint Realm. During the previous 3 months of cultivation, Chunzong's cultivation had always been at the early 7th Heaven Saint Realm. Now, due to the breakthrough in his cultivation technique, he had broken through to the intermediate stage. However, the intermediate stage did not stop there. His aura continued to strengthen and rise. He broke through again, reaching the late 7th Heaven Saint Realm. Chunzong's entire body was completely wrapped in so dense that it was almost tangible. It was as though a cocoon had been woven, and the person inside the cocoon seemed to be undergoing a transformation. His aura grew stronger again. Peak 7th Heaven Saint Realm. Gradually, the aura of the peak 7th Heaven Saint Realm stabilized. A breakthrough from the early 7th Heaven Saint Realm to the peak 7th Heaven Saint Realm was truly shocking. Moreover, this was a breakthrough in his cultivation technique that had reached perfection. The increase in his strength was even more obvious. Soon after, a large amount of yuan qi of heaven and earth surged and gradually condensed behind Chunzong. It condensed into a round ball that was white and emitted traces of light. It was like a white sun. This was the technique intent of the great mystic origin technique. As soon as this technique intent appeared, Chunzong immediately felt his great mystic origin saint force become even purer. It was about 30% purer. Different cultivation techniques often had different effects. When one cultivated to perfection and grasped merit intent, its effects would be stimulated to the extreme. Before the great mystic origin technique reached perfection, it was relatively weak among the top saint-level technique. However, after reaching perfection and mastering the technique intent, it could increase the power of the great mystic origin technique by 30%. It would greatly increase the power of the great mystic origin technique and would no longer be inferior to top saint-level technique. With this, the gap between Chunzong and the other peerless prodigies in terms of cultivation techniques had almost disappeared. In other aspects, he had an advantage. His strength had become stronger. Chapter 1593. As the eldest son, he had to welcome the guests, treat them to good food and drink, toast them, and finally send them off. After a series of events, the 6 paths was drunk, so I stopped updating yesterday. Today, I had to clean up and entertain the guests, which took me a whole day. However, I drank too much yesterday, so I didn't dare to drink today. Now, I'm telling everyone that I'll update yesterday. Luckily, the 6 paths would find time to write 1 or 2 more chapters, otherwise, I wouldn't be able to update at all. After coming out of seclusion, Chunzong was about to enter the Void battlefield through the Void Passage when he met the Divine Black Military Lord. The Savage Territory is about to open. I remember you have a spot, the Divine Black Military Lord said. What's so special about the Savage Territory? Chunzong didn't know much about it. The Wild Secret Territory is a secret territory left behind from the immemorial era. It has existed for a very long time, and it still has the terrain of the immemorial era. You can directly comprehend the mysteries of the heaven and earth. The mysterious spirit general said, his face full of yearning. Being able to touch the mysteries of heaven and earth directly, at a close distance, and being able to comprehend the mysteries of heaven and earth more directly was a great opportunity. Unfortunately, it wasn't easy to enter the Savage Territory. Everyone could only enter it once in their lifetime. The Divine Black Military Lord had entered it once many years ago and gained a lot. He wanted to enter it again, but unfortunately, he couldn't. Chunzong understood more about the Savage Territory from the Divine Black Military Lord, and he couldn't help but yearn for it. There were only 10 days left before the Savage Territory opened, so Chunzong didn't leave and waited in the Divine Black Military Lord's camp. The savage territory belonged to the Xianyuan world and had nothing to do with the other 8 worlds. Therefore, those who entered would be cultivators from the Xianyuan world. Apart from the Xianyuan dynasty, there would also be people from the Black Absolute Palace and Dustless Palace. Moreover, the savage territory didn't have a restriction on cultivation and age. In theory, anyone was qualified to enter. However, according to the past, the highest cultivation was the peak of the 9th level Saint Realm, and the lowest was the Middle Saint Realm. After all, most of the half-step Great Saints had already entered the savage territory. Those who hadn't were unable to enter due to various reasons. The entrance to the savage territory was between the Black Absolute Palace and Dustless Palace. It was a valley named Savage Valley. Perhaps it was because of the Savage Desolation secret realm. The landscape of the Savage Valley was different from other places. It looked very barren, without a single blade of grass growing. There was a desolate aura everywhere, which was incompatible with the aura outside the valley. However, it would not be assimilated, and was a whole of its own. This was the savage territory. When everyone stepped into the Savage Valley, they immediately felt a desolate aura assaulting their bodies. This kind of aura was different from the aura of the heaven and earth essence chi, but it did not cause any adverse effects. Chen Zong allowed the aura of the desolate mountain to wash over his body. He felt that this aura seemed to be of great help in tempering his body. It was even more effective than spiritual chi. One by one, figures entered the Savage Valley. Their bodies were filled with an astonishingly powerful aura. Immediately after, Chen Zong felt a pair of eyes staring at him. It was a familiar face, Chu Wangshi. Chu Wangshi's eyes were filled with unwillingness. Until now, he still couldn't accept the fact that Chen Zong was stronger than him. Instantly, a peerlessly formidable sword insight soared through the sky. Its sharp aura covered the heavens and the earth, and it seemed as if it could even slice space into pieces. Boundless, shapeless, and traceless sword chi sprayed out in a vast and mighty manner, and it was like a surging tide that surged towards the surroundings, causing everyone to be extremely horrified. Chen Zong's attention was immediately attracted. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the source of the terrifyingly sharp sword will. His pupils contracted. This sword intent, this sharpness, was too shocking. It was like an invisible sword had arrived and was crazily slicing his body. It was as if it wanted to tear him into pieces and shatter him into pieces. Such sharpness pierced straight into one's mind and soul. The others felt better, but the sword cultivators felt it especially obvious. It was as if a terrifying sword had locked onto them. Their bodies trembled and their hair stood on end. They felt as if there was a heavenly sword hanging in the sky above their heads. It was about to fall and pierce through them, shatter the earth, and turn them into dust. An extremely sharp gaze swept across, as if it contained the sharpness to break everything. No one dared to look at it directly. When that gaze met with Chen Zong's, it was as if an invisible chi was pulling. In an instant, an even more shocking sharpness shot out, piercing through the sky. It also seemed to pierce Chen Zong's eyes and penetrate Chen Zong's mind and will. Under such a terrifying gaze, those who didn't have a strong will couldn't withstand it. They would be defeated directly, leaving a shadow in their heart. From then on, their path of sword Dao would be cut off, and it would be difficult for them to move forward. However, Chen Zong's sword intent was tyrannical, and his mind was incomparably tough. He wasn't affected at all, but he still felt a trace of pressure. That pressure seemed to pierce through his mind and soul. Sword intent. An extremely tyrannical sword intent, a sword intent that seemed to be above everything. Under this sword intent, it seemed that everything was like an ant. "You're that Jiandi Chenzong?" The owner of the extremely sharp sword will spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it sounded like the clanging of metal. His words were like invisible swords as they tore through the air. Between the heavens and the earth, there seemed to be a terrifying tide of sword chi that surged and smashed down mercilessly. Under the pressure of this extremely terrifying sword chi, there seemed to be a vacuum that made Chen Zong feel suffocated. Chen Zong's expression changed slightly. The sharpness in his eyes became more and more condensed, as if it had turned into the tip of a sword, piercing through the sky and penetrating everything. Between heaven and earth, there was nothing that could stop its sharpness. His eyes seemed to have turned into the tip of a sword, sweeping through everything and tearing the sky. Collision. Formless energy rippled out in all directions as countless ripples spread out. Those were countless formless sword chi that tore through the sky and shattered everything, causing everyone in the surroundings to be greatly shocked. They all retreated, afraid that they would be affected. Not bad, you do have some skills. The person in the sky who was surrounded by extremely terrifying sword intent spoke again. His voice was so sharp that it seemed to be able to tear through everything in the world. It was unstoppable and invincible. A sonorous sound resounded through heaven and earth. An extremely dazzling light bloomed. It was as if the light of the sun was highly condensed, illuminating heaven and earth. It was above all living beings and above heaven and earth. A sword. It was a sword. It was a sword that was extremely dazzling. Chen Zong was instantly locked on by an increasingly terrifying aura, and his hair stood on end. His 5 fingers on his right hand moved slightly, and as fast as lightning, he clasped the hilt of the extreme edge sword. It only took a moment for the extreme edge sword to be unsheathed, blooming with an unparalleled sharpness. This person was very strong. A strong opponent. An absolutely strong opponent. From the aura, Chen Zong could sense that this person's cultivation base was at the 9th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage. Moreover, it was not something an ordinary 9th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage could compare to. The difference between him and Ming Daozi was like the difference between a firefly and the moon. Even so, Chen Zong was not afraid at all. If you want to fight, wait until after the trip to the Wild Secret Zone. In an instant, a majestic voice rang out from the 9 heavens with an unparalleled pressure. It seemed to suppress all resistance and injustice, making it difficult for anyone to resist. Under the terrifying pressure, whether it was Chen Zong or the figure in the sky who was emitting a terrifying aura, all of them were affected. They could not unsheathe their swords, and the sword light dimmed. The person who spoke was a half-step Great Saint stage powerhouse. This was the Wild Valley, and fierce fighting was not allowed. Otherwise, it would cause unnecessary damage. When the pressure dissipated, Chen Zong's right hand also left the sword hilt and relaxed slightly. The figure in the sky that emitted an incomparably astonishing aura sheathed his sword, and the astonishingly dazzling sword light dissipated. His extremely terrifying aura was also completely withdrawn. After the Wild Secret Zone, I want to see if you have the qualifications to be called a Jiendi. The person stared at Chen Zong, and his words were as sharp as a sword. Anytime, Chen Zong replied unhurriedly as he thought about the other party's identity. With such a cultivation base and sword intent, he was not an ordinary cultivator. In the Xian Yuan world, he was an extremely famous person. Chen Zong was no longer a rookie, and he had a good understanding of the geniuses and experts in the Xian Yuan world. His thoughts were as fast as lightning, and after thinking for a while, he immediately thought of a person who matched this person. Sword King Tian. This title was bestowed by the King Naming Pagoda. He was ranked above average on the 8-colored King Naming Monument and was a Sword Dao expert. Sword King Tian came from an extraordinary background, and his talent was astonishing. It was said that when he was born, he had sword chi that spanned 1,000 feet across the sky. He was taken in by the Black Absolute Palace, and became the disciple of the Black Absolute Palace's first elder, who taught him with great care. Sword King Tian also did not disappoint, and he improved by leaps and bounds. He was the best among his peers, and no one in the Black Absolute Palace could match him. Even his peers in the Unsullied Hall were suppressed. In that era, many geniuses in the Xianyuan dynasty could not compete with him. It could be said that more than 100 years ago, Sword King Tian was almost invincible with his sword in hand. It was also because of this that Sword King Tian comprehended the sword intent of Ling Tian, and it was at the high-level Dao intent level. After that, he constantly honed it, and it was said that he once stepped into the vast wilderness, and used his sword to hone himself, causing the sword intent of Ling Tian to become a top-level Dao intent, and its power increased greatly. Sword King Tian, who grasped a top-level Dao intent, was naturally even stronger. It could be said that in the Xianyuan world, Sword King Tian was definitely one of the strongest below half-step Great Sage experts. He was also known as the #1 Sword Dao below half-step Great Sage expert. Sword King Tian. Sword intent of Ling Tian. Sword intent of Ling Tian did not allow others to surpass him. This was his belief, will, and path. And now, Chen Zong practiced his sword, challenged the monarch bestowment pagoda, and even obtained the title of Jiandi. Sword King. Jiandi. Anyone could tell who was superior and who was inferior. On the monarch bestowment monument there were not many sword kings, but there were also quite a number of them. As for Jiandi, there was only one such person in all of history. Sword King Tian was naturally unconvinced. His sword Dao was Ling Tian, which was above the heavens and earth, let alone humans. Coincidentally, the last time the savage mystic realm opened, Sword King Tian was in the vast wilderness, roaming the world with his sword, and missed the opportunity. This time, he obtained the opportunity to enter the savage mystic realm, and met Chen Zong. Sword King Tian. Chen Zong murmured. His blood essence seemed to be boiling, and traces of sword intent were born in his heart, gradually condensing. Heart sword Dao intent originated from the heart. Sword King Ling Tian was an expert in the sword Dao. He was an excellent opponent, an opponent that could be of great help to his sword Dao. Chapter 1594. The third and fourth chapters are to make up for yesterday's update. The terrain of the Savage Valley was strange. It was like a desert, barren and desolate. However, it was not very big. Normally, this place was very desolate and few people came here. Only now, when the Savage Territory was about to open, many people came from afar. It was said that every time the Savage Territory opened, it could only accommodate a limited number of people. After all, the Savage Territory originated from the Primordial Age. It was a territory left behind from the Primordial Age. With the passage of time, it became rarer and rarer. Because the Savage Territory originated from the Primordial Age, it was incompatible with the present. When people of the present entered the Savage Territory, they would carry the aura of the present, clashing with the savage aura of the Primordial Age. When the aura of the present reached a certain level, it would affect the Savage Territory, causing it to collapse and cease to exist. Therefore, when the Savage Territory opened, there was a limit to the number of people who could enter. The Xianyuan dynasty could enter 200 people. The Black Absolute Palace and Wuchun Hall could enter 100 people each. Since there was a limit to the number of people, there would naturally be a distribution. Not everyone could get it, and not everyone could get it. 200 people might sound like a lot, but compared to the entire Xianyuan dynasty, it was insignificant. One had to know that there were many cultivators in the Xianyuan dynasty. There were many cultivators who wanted to enter the Savage Baron's secret territory. Back then, in order to recruit Chen Zong, the Divine Black Army promised to give him a place to enter the Savage Territory. It was reasonable for Chu Wangshi to get a place. After all, he was the personal disciple of Sage Xianyuan, a supreme saint expert. So was Chu Yuqing. The 200 spots were divided. The Xianyuan royal family took the majority, The Xiantian army and the Zhenyuan guards each took a portion, and the last portion was distributed among the other powerful forces. The number of spots that each powerful force could get was actually not many. At most, they could get 2 or 3. At least, they could get 1. Most of the forces could not even get 1. This kind of opportunity had always been controlled by a more powerful force. As for Sword King Towering Heaven obtaining a spot, it was very normal. After all, he was the strongest person among his peers in Darkness Absolute Palace. He could be considered one of the best among his peers in the entire Mystic Essence world. He could be considered one of the top 3 super experts. Waiting. The 400 qualified people were waiting in the Savage Valley for the secret realm to open. As time passed, the ancient aura in the Savage Barren Valley grew thicker and thicker. This meant that the Savage Barren Mystery Realm was about to open. Chen Zong stood there with his back as straight as a sword. His eyes were slightly closed, leaving only a sliver of light hidden in them. The non-quenching jade art was running slowly, constantly tempering his body and improving his body refining cultivation. The primordial aura here was of no help to the Qi cultivation Dao, but it was of great help to the body cultivation Dao. Although Chen Zong had been cultivating his body tempering all this while, it was only as a support. What he really improved was his Qi refinement. Therefore, after so many years, his Qi refinement cultivation had reached the peak of the 7th Heaven Saint Rudiment stage, but his body tempering cultivation was only at the early 6th Heaven Chaos Heaven stage. Wisps of pure desolate Qi were absorbed into his body. The rank 5 purple blaze of devastation burned, further refining the desolate Qi and integrating it into his body. Little by little, it strengthened his chaotic sky force, further refining his body, improving his physique, and improving his body refining cultivation. The others did not just wait. Some stood quietly, some sat down, and so on. They all cultivated or comprehended. Some people made small gestures with their hands, as if they were demonstrating the profundity of martial arts. The spots were very limited. Therefore, those who could get a spot were usually extraordinary. They were at least at the level of geniuses. All of them knew the importance of opportunities. Before entering, they had to improve themselves as much as possible. Sharpening one's sword before the battle, even if it was not fast, it would still shine. Suddenly, a buzzing sound rang out. It was as if it came from the ancient times. It was vigorous, and endless. An arc streaked across the sky like a ray of light breaking through the clouds. In an instant, it stretched and spread out. It was as if a different space-time was gradually revealing itself. Everyone's attention was attracted. Their eyes shone with a sharp light as they stared, as if they could see through the void. It's here. The Savage Barren Secret Zone is about to open. Everyone felt the sudden surge of the primordial aura and was immediately delighted. Of the 400 people, other than experts like the Heaven Almighty Sword King, there was no lack of other famous experts in the Xianyuan world, such as the Heaven-Raising Saber King, True Lord Vast Sea, and so on. They stared and stopped cultivating. They focused on waiting for the opening of the Savage Barren Secret Zone. The arc of light continued to stretch and expand. It was as if an illusory outline of a world was gradually cutting into the space of the Xianyuan world of Tianyuan Sacred Region. When the arc of light stretched to about 10 meters, it stopped and stabilized. "Let's go!" someone shouted. Instantly, he turned into a ray of light and flew out at an astonishing speed. He rushed toward the arc of light in an instant. That was the entrance to the Savage Barren Secret Zone. The 400 people moved quickly. They fought to be the first to enter, and each of them displayed a different profound movement technique. Chen Zong turned into a ray of lightning and flew out in an instant. Among the 400 people, Chen Zong's cultivation was not the highest. He was at the peak of the 7th level Saint Rudiment stage, which was only above average. There were dozens of people whose cultivation was higher than Chen Zong's, but not all of them were stronger than Chen Zong. An ordinary 9th-level Saint Rudiment stage was no match for Chen Zong. He could kill him with a single strike. Chen Zong did not know how strong he was at the peak of the 7th-level Saint Rudiment stage. However, he would be able to verify it in the Savage Baron secret zone. In the blink of an eye, the bolt of lightning that Chen Zong had transformed into entered the arc of light. An extremely dense and ancient aura assaulted Chen Zong's face, making him feel as if his entire body was soaked in a dense and almost liquefied ancient aura. He continued to circulate the non-quenching jade technique until it reached its peak and broke through. The blazing aura swept through his body. It was as if he was in a furnace that was being tempered. Then, Chen Zong felt his bones become harder and his muscles become tighter. His body refinement cultivation had broken through. Intermediate 6th-level Chaotic Heaven stage. Breaking through from the initial stage to the middle stage was not much of an improvement, and it was not of much help to Chen Zong's overall strength. However, it was still better than nothing. More importantly, it would be easier to raise his body tempering cultivation in this place. Previously, his body refinement cultivation had improved slowly not only because he did not have as much time and energy as chi refinement, but also because of the cultivation environment and resources. Compared to chi refinement, body refinement was not as particular about talent. Instead, it was more about hard work and resources. As long as one worked hard enough and had enough resources, they could improve faster. The Savage Baron secret zone had retained the landform of the Primordial Era. During the Primordial Era, body refinement was popular, but chi refinement was nowhere to be seen. The Primordial Era was a golden age for body refinement. Chen Zong's body refinement cultivation did not stop there. Pure, primordial aura continued to enter his body and raise his body refinement cultivation bit by bit. Chen Zong estimated that even if he did not take the initiative to cultivate, he would be able to raise his body refinement cultivation to the late stage of the 6th-level Chaos Heaven stage by the time the Savage Secret Zone closed. Its appearance was somewhat similar to a cow, but it was more domineering. Immemorial desolate beast giant armored bull. Someone suddenly exclaimed. Immemorial desolate beasts were beasts that only existed in the Primordial Era. They were extinct in the Lingwu sacred world because the environment in the Lingwu sacred world was not suitable for immemorial desolate beasts. However, the landscape of the Savage Baron secret zone originated from the Primordial Era and was not much different from the Primordial Era. Therefore, it was normal for immemorial desolate beasts to inhabit it. Previously, Chen Zong had talked with the Divine Xian General. The General had told Chen Zong a lot of information about the Savage Baron secret zone. Chen Zong knew that there were immemorial desolate beasts in the Savage Baron secret zone. Giant Armored Bull. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.